Part 1, Chapter 65 of the Guide for the Perplexed by Moses Maimonides. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 65. After you have advanced thus far, and truly comprehended that God exists without having the attribute of existence, and that he is one without having the attribute of unity, I do not think that I need explain to you the inadmissibility of the attribute of speech in reference to God, especially since our people generally believe that the law, id est, the word ascribed to him, was created. Speech is attributed to him insofar as the word which Moses heard was produced and brought to existence by God in the same manner as he produced all his other works and creations. As we shall have to speak more fully on prophecy, we shall here merely show that speech is attributed to God in the same way as all other actions which are similar to our own. When we are told that God addressed the prophets and spoke to them, our minds are merely to receive a notion that there is a divine knowledge to which the prophets attain. We are to be impressed with the idea that the things which the prophets communicate to us come from the Lord and are not altogether the products of their own conceptions and ideas. This subject, which we have already mentioned above, will receive further explanation. It is the object of this chapter to show that the words speaking and saying are synonymous terms denoting A, speech, as exempli gratia, Moses shall speak, Yedabbar, Exodus 19:19, and Pharaoh said, Va'yomer, Ibid 5:5, B, thought, as formed in the mind without being expressed in words, exempli gratia, and I thought, v'amarti, in my heart, Ecclesiastes 2:15, and I thought, v'debarti, in my heart, Ibid, and thy heart will imagine, Yedabbar, Proverbs 23:33, concerning thee my heart thought, Amar, Psalms 27:8. And Esau thought, Va'yomer, in his heart, Genesis 27:41. Examples of this kind are numerous. See, will, exempli gratia, and he said, Va'yomer, to slay David, 2 Samuel 21:16. That is to say, he wished or he intended to slay him. Dost thou desire, Omer, to slay me? Exodus 2:14. And the whole congregation intended, Va'yomeru, to stone them. Numbers 14:10. Instances of this kind are likewise numerous. The two terms, when applied to God, can only have one of the two last-mentioned significations. Videlicet, he wills, and he desires, or he thinks, and there is no difference whether the divine thought became known to man by means of an actual voice, or by one of those kinds of inspiration which I shall explain further on. Part 2, Chapter 38. We must not suppose that in speaking God employed voice or sound, or that he has a soul in which the thoughts reside, and that these thoughts are things superadded to his essence. But we ascribe and attribute to him thoughts in the same manner as we ascribe to him any other attributes. The use of these words in the sense of will and desire is based, as I have explained, on the homonymity of these terms. In addition, they are figures borrowed from our common practices, as has been already pointed out. For we cannot, at a first glance, see how anything can be produced by a mere desire. We think that he who wishes to produce a thing must perform a certain act or command someone else to perform it. Therefore, the command is figuratively ascribed to God when that takes place which he wishes, and we then say that he commanded that a certain thing should be accomplished. All this has its origin in our comparing the acts of God to our own acts, and also in the use of the term amar in the sense of he desired, as we have already explained. The words, "and he said," occurring in the account of the creation, signify he wished or he desired. This has already been stated by other authors, and is well known. A proof for this, namely that the phrase "God said" in the first chapter of Genesis must be taken in a figurative sense, he willed, and not in its literal meaning, is found in the circumstance that a command can only be given to a being which exists and is capable of receiving the command. Compare, "By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth." Psalms 33:6. His mouth and the breath of his mouth are undoubtedly figurative expressions, and the same is the case with his word and his speech. The meaning of the verse is therefore that they, the heavens and all their host, exist through his will and desire. All our eminent authorities are cognizant of this, and I need not explain that in Hebrew, amar and dibber have the same meaning, as is proved by the passage, "For it has heard all the words, Imra, of the Lord which he spake, dibber, unto us." Joshua 24:27. End of chapter 65. Part 1, Chapter 66 of the Guide for the Perplexed by Moses Maimonides. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 66. And the tables were the work of God. Exodus 32:16. That is to say, they were the products of nature, not of art. For all natural things are called the work of the Lord. Exempli gratia. These see the works of the Lord. Psalms 107:24. And the description of the several things in nature, as plants, animals, wind, rain, etc., is followed by the exclamation, "O Lord, how manifold are thy works!" Psalms 104:24. Still more striking is the relation between God and his creatures, as expressed in the phrase, "the cedars of Lebanon which he hath planted." Ibid 16. The cedars, being the product of nature and not of art, are described as having been planted by the Lord. Similarly, we explain, "And the writing was the writing of God." Exodus 32:16. The relation in which the writing stood to God has already been defined in the words, "written with the finger of God." Ibid 31:18. And the meaning of this phrase is the same as that of "the work of thy fingers." Psalms 8:4. This being said of the heavens. Of the latter it has been stated distinctly that they were made by a word. Compare, "By the word of the Lord were the heavens made." Ibid 33:6. Hence you learn that in the Bible, the creation of a thing is figuratively expressed by terms denoting word and speech. The same thing which according to one passage has been made by the word is represented in another passage as made by the finger of God. The phrase "written by the finger of God" is therefore identical with "written by the word of God," and if the latter phrase had been used, it would have been equal to "written by the will and desire of God." Onkelos adopted in this place a strange explanation, and rendered the words literally, "written by the finger of the Lord." He thought that the finger was a certain thing ascribed to God, so that the finger of the Lord is to be interpreted in the same way as the mountain of God, Exodus 3:1, the rod of God, Ibid 4:20, that is, as being an instrument created by him, which by his will engraved the writing on the tables. I cannot see why Onkelos preferred this explanation. It would have been more reasonable to say written by the word of the Lord, in imitation of the verse, by the word of the Lord the heavens were made. Or was the creation of the writing on the tables more difficult than the creation of the stars and the spheres? As the latter were made by the direct will of God, not by means of an instrument, the writing may also have been produced by his direct will, not by means of an instrument. You know that the Mishnah says, 10 things were created on Friday in the twilight of the evening, and the writing is one of the 10 things. This shows how generally it was assumed by our forefathers that the writing of the tables was produced in the same manner as the rest of the creation, as we have shown in our commentary on the Mishnah, Abot 5:6. End of chapter 66. Part 1, Chapter 67 of the Guide for the Perplexed by Moses Maimonides. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 67. Since the verb to say has been figuratively used to express the will of the Creator, and the phrase, and he said, has repeatedly been employed in the account of all the things created in the 6 days of the beginning, the expression to rest has likewise been figuratively applied to God in reference to the Sabbath day, on which there was no creation. It is therefore said, and he rested, vayushbot, on the 7th day, Genesis 2:2. For to leave off speaking is, in Hebrew, likewise expressed by the same verb, as exempli gratia, so these 3 men ceased, vayishbetu, to answer Job. Job 32:1. Also by Nuach, as in, they spake to Nabal, according to all those words in the name of David, and he ceased. Vayanuchu, 1 Samuel 25:9. In my opinion, vayanuchu means they ceased to speak and waited for the answer, for no allusion to exertion whatever having previously been mentioned, the words and they rested, in its primary signification, would have been entirely out of place in that narrative, even if the young men who spoke had really used some exertion. The author relates that having delivered that whole speech, which, as you find, consisted of gentle expressions, they were silent, that is to say, they did not add any word or act by which the reply of Nabal could be justified, it being the object of the entire passage to represent Nabal's conduct as extremely reprehensible. In that sense, vide licet, to cease or to leave off, the verb nuach is used in the phrase, and he left off, vayanach, on the 7th day. Our sages and some of the commentators took, however, nuach in its primary sense to rest, but as a transitive form, hifel, explaining the phrase thus, and he gave rest to the world on the 7th day. Id est, no further act of creation took place on that day. It is possible that the word vayanach is derived either from yanach, a verb of the class period, or nacha, a verb of the class lamed he, and has this meaning: he established or he governed the universe in accordance with the properties it possessed on the 7th day. That is to say, while on each of the 6 days events took place contrary to the natural laws now in operation throughout the universe, on the 7th day the universe was merely upheld and left in the condition in which it continues to exist. Our explanation is not impaired by the fact that the form of the word deviates from the rules of verbs of these two classes, for there are frequent exceptions to the rules of conjugations, and especially of the weak verbs, and any interpretation which removes such a source of error must not be abandoned because of certain grammatical rules. We know that we are ignorant of the sacred language, and that grammatical rules only apply to the majority of cases. The same root is also found as a verb einverv in the sense to place and to set, as exempli gratia, and it shall be established, and she shall be placed, verhuniche, there upon her own base. Zechariah 5:11, and she suffered neither the birds of the air to settle, le nuach, on them. 2 Samuel 21:10. According to my opinion, the verb has the same signification in Habakkuk 3:16, that I might remain firm, anuach, in the day of trouble. The word v'nefesh is a verb derived from nefesh, the homonymity of which we have already explained, chapter 41, namely, that it has the signification of intention or will. V'nefesh accordingly means that which he desired was accomplished, and what he wished had come into existence. End of chapter 67. Part 1, Chapter 68 of the Guide for the Perplexed by Moses Maimonides. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 68. You are acquainted with the well-known principle of the philosophers that God is the intellectus, the ens intelligens, and the ens intelligibile. These three things are in God one and the same, and do not in any way constitute a plurality. We have also mentioned in our larger work, Mishneh Torah, and we have explained there that it is a fundamental principle of our religion, namely, that he is absolutely one, that nothing combines with him, that is to say, there is no eternal thing besides him. On that account, we say, Chai Adonai, the Lord liveth, Ruth 3:13, and not Che Adonai, the life of the Lord, for his life is not a thing distinct from his essence, as we have explained in treating of the inadmissibility of the attributes. There is no doubt that he who has not studied any works on mental philosophy, who has not comprehended the nature of the mind, who has no knowledge of its essence, and considers it in no other way than he would consider the nature of whiteness and of blackness, will find this subject extremely difficult. And to him our principle that the intellectus, the intelligens, and the intelligibile are in God one and the same thing will appear as unintelligible as if we said that the whiteness, the whitening substance, and the material which is whitened are one and the same thing. And indeed, many ignorant people refute at once our principle by using such comparisons. Even amongst those who imagine that they are wise, many find this subject difficult, and are of opinion that it is impossible for the mind to grasp the truth of this proposition, although it is a demonstrated truth, as has been shown by metaphysicians. I will tell you now what has been proved. Man, before comprehending a thing, comprehends it in potentia, duname. When, however, he comprehends a thing, exempli gratia, the form of a certain tree which is pointed out to him, when he abstracts its form from its substance and reproduces the abstract form, an act performed by the intellect, he comprehends in reality, energeia, and the intellect which he has acquired in actuality is the abstract form of the tree in man's mind. For in such a case the intellect is not a thing distinct from the thing comprehended. It is therefore clear to you that the thing comprehended is the abstract form of the tree, and at the same time it is the intellect in action, and that the intellect and the abstract form of the tree are not two different things, for the intellect in action is nothing but the thing comprehended, and the agent by which the form of the tree has been turned into an intellectual and abstract object, namely that which comprehends, is undoubtedly the intellect in action. All intellect is identical with its action. The intellect in action is not a thing different from its action, for the true nature and essence of the intellect is comprehension, and you must not think that the intellect in action is a thing existing by itself, separate from comprehension, and that comprehension is a different thing connected with it, for the very essence of the intellect is comprehension. In assuming an intellect in action, you assume the comprehension of the thing comprehended. This is quite clear to all who have made themselves familiar with the figurative language common to this discipline. You therefore accept it as proved that the intellect consists in its action, which is its true nature and essence. Consequently, the very thing by which the form of that tree has been made abstract and intelligible, vide licet the intellect, is at the same time the intelligens, for the intellect is itself the agens, which abstracts the form and comprehends it, and that is the action on account of which it is called the intelligens. But itself and its actions are identical, and that which is called intellect in action consists, in the above-mentioned instance, of nothing else but of the form of the tree. It must now be obvious to you that whenever the intellect is found in action, the intellect and the thing comprehended are one and the same thing, and also that the function of all intellect, namely the act of comprehending, is its essence. The intellect, that which comprehends and that which is comprehended, are therefore the same whenever a real comprehension takes place. But when we speak of the power of comprehension, we necessarily distinguish between two things, the power itself and the thing which can be comprehended. Exemple gratia, the hylic intellect of Zaid is the power of comprehension, and this tree is in like manner a thing which is capable of being comprehended. These undoubtedly are two different things. When, however, the potential is replaced by the actual, and when the form of the tree has really been comprehended, the form comprehended is the intellect, and it is by that same intellect, by the intellect in action, that the tree has been converted into an abstract idea and has been comprehended. For everything in which a real action takes place exists in reality. On the other hand, the power of comprehension and the object capable of comprehension are two things, but that which is only potential cannot be imagined otherwise than in connection with an object possessing that capacity, as exempli gratia, man, and thus we have three things: the man who possesses the power and is capable of comprehending, that power itself, namely the power of comprehension, and the object which presents itself as an object of comprehension, and is capable of being comprehended. To use the foregoing example, the man, the hylic intellect, and the abstract form of the tree are three different things. They become one and the same thing when the intellect is in action, and you will never find the intellect different from the comprehensible object unless the power of comprehending and the power of being comprehended be referred to. Now, it has been proved that God is an intellect which always is in action, and that, as has been stated and as will be proved hereafter, there is in him at no time a mere potentiality, that he does not comprehend at one time and is without comprehension at another time, but he comprehends constantly. Consequently, he and the things comprehended are one and the same thing, that is to say, his essence, and the act of comprehending because of which it is said that he comprehends is the intellect itself, which is likewise his essence. God is therefore always the intellectus, the intelligens, and the intelligibile. We have thus shown that the identity of the intellect, the intelligens, and the intelligibile is not only a fact as regards the Creator, but as regards all intellect when in action. There is, however, this difference, that from time to time our intellect passes over from mere potentiality to reality, and that the pure intellect, id est, the active intellect, finds sometimes obstacles, though not in itself, but accidentally, in some external cause. It is not our present intention to explain this subject, but we will merely show that God alone, and none besides him, is an intellect constantly in action, and there is, neither in himself nor in anything beside him, any obstacle whereby his comprehension would be hindered. Therefore, he always includes the intelligens, the intellectus, and the intelligibile, and his essence is at the same time the intelligens, the intelligibile, and the intellectus, as is necessarily the case with all intellect in action. We have reiterated this idea in the present chapter because it is exceedingly abstruse, and I do not apprehend that the reader will confound intellectual comprehension with the representative faculty, with the reproduction of the material image in our imagination, since this work is designed only for those who have studied philosophy and who know what has already been said on the soul and its faculties. End of chapter 68. Part 1, Chapter 69 of the Guide for the Perplexed by Moses Maimonides. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 69. The philosophers, as you know, call God the first cause, in Hebrew, Illa and Sibba. But those who are known by the name of Mutakallimim are very much opposed to the use of that name, and call him Agens, believing that there is a great difference whether we say that God is the cause or that he is the Agens. They argue thus: if we say that God is the cause, the coexistence of the cause with that which was produced by the cause would necessarily be implied. This again would involve the belief that the universe was eternal, and that it was inseparable from God. When, however, we say that God is the agens, the coexistence of the agens with its product is not implied, for the agens can exist anterior to its product. We cannot even imagine how an agens can be in action unless it existed before its own production. This is an argument advanced by persons who do not distinguish between the potential and the actual. You, however, should know that in this case there is no difference whether you employ the term cause or agens. For if you take the term cause in the sense of a mere potentiality, it precedes its effect. But if you mean the cause in action, then the effect must necessarily coexist with the cause in action. The same is the case with the agens. Take it as an agens. In reality, the work must necessarily coexist with its agens. For the builder, before he builds the house, is not in reality a builder, but has the faculty for building a house, in the same way as the materials for the house before it is being built are merely in potentia. But when the house has been built, he is the builder in reality, and his product must likewise be in actual existence. Nothing is therefore gained by choosing the term agens and rejecting the term cause. My object here is to show that these two terms are equal, and in the same manner as we call God an agens, although the work does not yet exist, only because there is no hindrance or obstacle which might prevent him from doing it whenever he pleases, we may also call him the cause, although the effect may not yet be in existence. The reason why the philosophers called God the cause and did not call him the agens is not to be sought in their belief that the universe is eternal, but in other motives, which I will briefly describe to you. It has been shown in the science of physics that everything except the primal cause owes its origin to the following four causes: the substance, the form, the agens, the final cause. There are sometimes direct, sometimes indirect causes, but each by itself is called a cause. They also believe, and I do not differ from their opinion, that God himself is the agens, the form, and the end. Therefore they call God the cause in order to express that he unites in himself these three causes, vide licet, that he is the agens, the form, and the final cause of the universe. In the present chapter, I only wish to show you in what sense it may be said of God that he is the agens, the form, and also the final cause of the universe. You need not trouble yourself now with the question whether the universe has been created by God, or whether, as the philosophers have assumed, it is eternal, coexisting with him. You will find in the pages of this treatise full and instructive information on the subject. Here I wish to show that God is the cause of every event that takes place in the world, just as he is the creator of the whole universe as it now exists. It has already been explained in the science of physics that a cause must again be sought for each of the four divisions of causes. When we have found for any existing thing those four causes which are in immediate connection with it, we find for these again causes, and for these again other causes, and so on, until we arrive at the first causes. Exempli gratia, a certain production has its agens. This agens again has its agens, and so on, until at last we arrive at a first agens, which is the true agens throughout all the intervening links. If the letter aleph be moved by bet, bet by gimel, gimel by dalet, and dalet by he, and as the series does not extend to infinity, let us stop at he, there is no doubt that the he moves the letters aleph, bet, gimel, and dalet, and we say correctly that the aleph is moved by he. In that sense, everything occurring in the universe, although directly produced by certain nearer causes, is ascribed to the Creator, as we shall explain. He is the agens, and he is therefore the ultimate cause. We shall also find, after careful examination, that every physical and transient form must be preceded by another such form, by which the substance has been fitted to receive the next form. The previous form again has been preceded by another, and we arrive at length at that form which is necessary for the existence of all intermediate forms, which are the causes of the present form. That form to which the forms of all existing things are traced is God. You must not imagine that when we say that God is the first form of all forms existing in the universe, we refer to that first form which Aristotle in the book of Metaphysics describes as being without beginning and without end, for he treats of a form which is a physical, not a purely intellectual one. When we call God the ultimate form of the universe, we do not use this term in the sense of form connected with substance, namely, as the form of that substance, as though God were the form of a material being. It is not in this sense that we use it, but in the following. Everything existing and endowed with a form is whatever it is through its form, and when that form is destroyed, its whole existence terminates and is obliterated. The same is the case as regards the relation between God and all distant causes of existing beings. It is through the existence of God that all things exist, and it is He who maintains their existence by that process which is called emanation, in Hebrew, shefah, as will be explained in one of the chapters of the present work. If God did not exist, suppose this were possible, the universe would not exist, and there would be an end to the existence of the distant causes, the final effects, and the intermediate causes. Consequently, God maintains the same relation to the world as the form has to a thing endowed with a form. Through the form, it is what it is, and on it the reality and essence of the thing depends. In this sense, we may say that God is the ultimate form, that He is the form of all forms, that is to say, the existence and continuance of all forms in the last instance depend on Him. The forms are maintained by Him in the same way as all things endowed with forms retain their existence through their forms. On that account, God is called in the sacred language Ha-Olamim, the life of the universe, as will be explained chapter 72. The same argument holds good in reference to all final causes. If you assign to a thing a certain purpose, you can find for that purpose another purpose. We mention, exempli gratia, a wooden chair. Its substance is wood, the joiner is its agens, the square its form, and its purpose is that one should sit upon it. You may then ask, for what purpose does one sit upon it? The answer will be that he who is sitting upon it desires to be high above the ground. If again you ask, for what purpose does he desire to be high above the ground? You will receive the answer that he wishes to appear high in the eyes of those who see him. For what purpose does he wish to appear higher in the eyes of those who see him? That the people may respect and fear him. What is the good of his being feared? His commands will be respected. For what purpose are his commands to be respected? That people shall refrain from injuring each other. What is the object of this precaution? To maintain order amongst the people. In this way, one purpose necessitates the pre-existence of another, except the final purpose, which is the execution of the will of God, according to one of the opinions which have been propounded, as will be explained, Part 3, chapters 13 and 17. And the final answer will be, it is the will of God. According to the view of others, which will likewise be explained, the final purpose is the execution of the decree of His wisdom, and the final answer will be, it has been decreed by His wisdom. According to either opinion, the series of successive purposes terminates as has been shown in God's will or wisdom, which, in our opinion, are identical with His essence and are not anything separate from Himself or different from His essence. Consequently, God is the final purpose of everything. Again, it is the aim of everything to become, according to its faculties, similar to God in perfection. This is meant by the expression, His will which is identical with His essence, as will be shown below, Ibid. In this sense, God is called the end of all ends. I have thus explained to you in what sense God is said to be the agens, the form, and the end. This is the reason why the philosophers not only call him the maker, but also the cause. Some of the scholars belonging to the Mutakallimim, Mohammedan theologians, went so far in their folly and in their vainglory as to say that the non-existence of the Creator, if that were possible, would not necessarily imply the non-existence of the things created by him, id est, the universe. For a production need not necessarily cease to exist when the producer, after having produced it, has ceased to exist. They would be right if God were only the maker of the universe, and if its permanent existence were not dependent on him. The storehouse does not cease to exist at the death of the builder, for he does not give permanent existence to the building. God, however, is himself the form of the universe, as we have already shown, and it is he who causes its continuance and permanency. It is therefore wrong to say that a thing can remain durable and permanent after the being that makes it durable and permanent has ceased to exist, since that thing can possess no more durability and permanency than it has received from that being. Now you understand the greatness of the error into which they have fallen through their assumption that God is only the agens and not the end or the form. End of chapter 69. Part 1, Chapter 70 of the Guide for the Perplexed by Moses Maimonides. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 70. The term rakab, to ride, is a synonym. In its primary signification, it is applied to man's riding on an animal in the usual way. Exempli gratia, now he was riding, rokab, upon his ass, Numbers 22:22. It has then been figuratively used to denote dominion over a thing, because the rider governs and rules the animal he rides upon. Exempli gratia, he made him ride, yarkibahu, on the high places of the earth. Deuteronomy 32:13. And I will cause thee to ride, vaherkabtika, upon the high places of the earth. Isaiah 58:14. That is, you shall have dominion over the highest people on earth. I will make Ephraim to ride, Arkib, Hosea 10:11. Id est, I shall give him rule and dominion. In this same sense it is said of God, who rideth, Rokab, upon the heaven in thy help. Deuteronomy 33:26. That is, who rules the heavens. And him that rideth, la rokeb, upon the arabot. Psalms 68:4. Id est, who rules the arabot, the uttermost, all-encompassing sphere. It has also been repeatedly stated by our sages that there are 7 rekeim, firmaments, heavens, and that the uppermost of them, the all-surrounding, is called arabot. Do not object to the number 7 given by them, although there are more rekeim, for there are spheres which contain several circles, gilgalim, and are counted as one. This is clear to those who have studied that subject, and I shall also explain it. Here I wish merely to point out that our sages always assumed that arabot is the uppermost sphere. The arabot is also referred to in the words, who rideth upon the heavens in thy help. Thus we read in Babylonian Talmud Haggiga, page 12, the high and exalted dwelleth on arabot, as it is said, extol him that rideth upon arabot. Psalms 68:4. How is it proved that heaven and arabot are identical? The one passage has who rideth on arabot, the other who rideth upon the heaven. Hence it is clear that in all these passages reference is made to the same all-surrounding sphere, concerning which you will hereafter, Part 2, Chapter 24, receive more information. Consider well that the expression dwelling over it is used by them and not dwelling in it. The latter expression would have implied that God occupies a place or is a power in the sphere, as was in fact believed by the Sabians, who held that God was the soul of the sphere. By saying dwelling over it, they indicated that God was separate from the sphere and was not a power in it. Know also that the term riding upon the heavens has figuratively been applied to God in order to show the following excellent comparison. The rider is better than the animal upon which he rides. The comparative is only used for the sake of convenience, for the rider is not of the same class as the animal upon which he rides. Furthermore, the rider moves the animal and leads it as he likes. It is, as it were, his instrument, which he uses according to his will. He is separate from it, apart from it, not connected with it. In like manner, the uppermost sphere, by the rotation of which everything movable is set in motion, is moved by God, who is separate from the sphere and is not a power in it. In Bereshit Rabbah, we read that in commenting on the divine words, the eternal God is a refuge, literally a dwelling, Deuteronomy 33:27, our sages said, He is the dwelling of his world, the world is not his dwelling. This explanation is then followed by the remark, the horse is secondary to the rider is not subservient to the horse. This is meant by thou wilt ride upon thy horses. Habakkuk 3:8. Consider and learn how they described the relation of God to the sphere, asserting that the latter is his instrument by means of which he rules the universe. For whenever you find our sages saying that in a certain heaven are certain things, they do not mean to say that in the heavens there are any extraneous things, but that from a certain heaven the force emanates which is required for the production of certain things, and for their continuing in proper order. The proof for my statement you may find in the following sayings of our sages. The Arabot, in which there are justice, charity, right, treasures of life and peace, treasures of blessing, of the souls of the righteous, of the souls and the spirits of those to be born, and of the dew, by which God will at some future time revive the dead, etc. It is clear that the things enumerated here are not material, and do not occupy a place, for dew is not to be taken in its literal sense. Consider also that here the phrase in which, meaning in the Arabot, is used, and not over which, as if to say that all the things existing in the universe derive their existence from powers emanating from the Arabot, which God made to be the origin and the place of these powers. They are said to include the treasures of life, a perfectly true and correct assertion, for all existing life originates in that treasure of life, as will be mentioned below, chapter 72 and part 2, chapter 10. Reflect on the fact that the souls of the righteous as well as the souls and the spirits of those to be born are mentioned here. How sublime is this idea to him who understands it! For the soul that remains after the death of man is not the soul that lives in a man when he is born. The latter is a mere faculty, while that which has a separate existence after death is a reality. Again, the soul and the spirit of man during his life are two different things. Therefore, the souls and the spirits are both named as existing in man, but separate from the body, only one of them exists. We have already explained the homonymity of Ruach, spirit, in this work, and also at the end of Sefer HaMada'ah, Mishnah Torah, Hillel Teshubah 8:3-4, we treated of the homonymity of these expressions. Consider how these excellent and true ideas, comprehended only by the greatest philosophers, are found scattered in the Midrashim. When a student who disavows truth reads them, he will at first sight deride them, as being contrary to the real state of things. The cause of this is the circumstance that our sages spoke of these subjects in metaphors. They are too difficult for the common understanding of the people, as has been noticed by us several times. I will now return to the subject which I commenced to explain in order to bring it to a conclusion. Our sages commenced to adduce proofs from Scripture for their assertion that the things enumerated above are contained in the Arabot. As to justice and right, they quote, "Justice and judgment are the habitation of thy throne." Psalms 89:18. In the same way, they prove their assertion concerning all things enumerated by them by showing that they are described as being related to God, as being near him. Note this. In the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer it is said, God created 7 Rechaim, heavens, and out of all of them he selected the Arabot for his royal throne. Compare, exalt him who rideth upon the Arabot, Psalms 68:4. These are his, Rabbi Eliezer's words. Note them likewise. You must know that in Hebrew, the collective noun denoting animals used for riding is merkabah. Instances of this noun are not rare. And Joseph made ready his chariot, merkabto, Genesis 46:29. In the second chariot, bemerkabet, Ibid 41:43. Pharaoh's chariots, merkabot, Exodus 15:4. The following passage especially proves that the Hebrew merkabah denotes a collection of animals. And a merkabah came up and went out of Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, and a horse for 150. 1 Kings 10:21. Hence we may learn that merkabah denotes here 4 horses. Therefore I think that when it was stated according to the literal sense of the words that 4 chayot, beasts, carry the throne of glory, our sages called this merkabah on account of its similarity with the merkabah consisting of 4 single animals. So far has the theme of this chapter carried us, and we shall be compelled to make many further remarks on this subject. Here, however, it is our object and the aim of all we have said to show that who rideth upon heaven, Deuteronomy 33:26, means who sets the all-surrounding sphere in motion and turns it by his power and will. The same sense is contained in the conclusion of that verse, and in his excellency the spheres. Id est, who in his excellency moves the spheres, shechakim. In reference to the first sphere, the arabot, the verb to ride is used. In reference to the rest, the noun excellency, because through the motion of the uppermost sphere in its daily circuit, all the spheres move, participating as parts in the motion of the whole, and this being that great power that sets everything in motion, it is called excellency. Let this subject constantly remain in your memory when you study what I am going to say, for id est, the motion of the uppermost sphere, is the greatest proof for the existence of God, as I shall demonstrate. Note this. End of chapter 70.
Part 1, Chapter 71 of The Guide for the Perplexed. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Guide for the Perplexed by Moses Maimonides, translated by Michael Friedländer. The Chalam. Know that many branches of science relating to the correct solution of these problems were once cultivated by our forefathers, but were in the course of time neglected, especially in consequence of the tyranny which barbarous nations exercised over us. Besides, speculative studies were not open to all men, as we have already stated. Introduction, page 2, and Part 1, Chapter 31. Only the subjects taught in the Scriptures were accessible to all. Even the traditional law, as you're well aware, was not originally committed to writing, in conformity with the rule to which our nation generally adhered. Quote, "Things which I have communicated to you orally, you must not communicate to others in writing." End quote. With reference to the law, this rule was very opportune, for while it remained in force, it averted the evils which happened subsequently. Videlicet, great diversity of opinion, doubts as to the meaning of written words, slips of the pen, dissensions among the people, formation of new sects, and confused notions about practical subjects. The traditional teaching was in fact according to the words of the law entrusted to the great tribunal, as we have already stated in our works on the Talmud, Introduction to Mishneh Torah, and Introduction to Commentary on the Mishnah. Care having been taken, for the sake of obviating injurious influences, that the oral law should not be recorded in a form accessible to all, it was but natural that no portion of the secrets of the law, that is, metaphysical problems, would be permitted to be written down or divulged for the use of all men. These secrets, as has been explained, were orally communicated by a few able men to others who were equally distinguished. Hence the principle applied by our teachers, "The secrets of the law can only be entrusted to him who is a counselor, a cunning artificer, etc." The natural effect of this practice was that our nation lost the knowledge of those important disciplines. Nothing but a few remarks and allusions are to be found in the Talmud and the Midrashim, like a few kernels enveloped in such a quantity of husk that the reader is generally occupied with the husk and forgets that it encloses a kernel. In addition, you will find that in the few works composed by the Goyim and the Karaites on the unity of God and on such matter as is connected with this doctrine, they follow the lead of the Mohammedan Mutakalimim, and what they wrote is insignificant in comparison with the kindred works of the Mohammedans. It also happened that at the time when the Mohammedans adopted this method of the Kalam, there arose among them a certain sect called Mu'tazila, that is, separatists. In certain things our scholars followed the theory and the method of those Mu'tazila, although another sect, the Ash'ariya, with their own peculiar views, was subsequently established among the Mohammedans. You will not find any of these views in the writings of our authors, not because our authors preferred the opinions of the first-named sect to those of the latter, but because they chanced first to become acquainted with the theory of the Mu'tazila, which they adopted and treated as demonstrated truth. On the other hand, our Andalusian scholars followed the teachings of the philosophers, from whom they accepted those opinions which were not opposed to our religious principles. You will find that they did not adopt any of the methods of the Mutakalimim. In many respects they approached the view expressed in the present treatise, as may be noticed in the few works which were recently written by authors of that school. You should also know that whatever the Mohammedans, that is, the Mu'tazila and the Ash'ariya, said on those subjects consists in nothing but theories founded on propositions which are taken from the works of those Greek and Syrian scholars who attempted to oppose the system of the philosophers and to refute their arguments. The following was the cause of the opposition. At the time when the Christian Church brought the Greeks and Syrians into its fold and promulgated its well-known dogmas, the opinions of the philosophers were current amongst those nations, and whilst philosophy flourished, kings became defenders of the Christian faith. The learned Greek and Syrian Christians of the age, seeing that their dogmas were unquestionably exposed to severe attacks from the existing philosophical systems, laid the foundation for this science of dogmatics. They commenced by putting forth such propositions as would support their doctrines, and be useful for the refutation of opinions opposed to the fundamental principles of the Christian religion. When the Mohammedans caused Arabic translations of the writings of the philosophers to be made, those criticisms were likewise translated. When the opinions of John the Grammarian, of Ibn Adi, and of kindred authors on those subjects were made accessible to them, they adopted them, and imagined that they had arrived at the solution of important problems. Moreover, they selected from the opinions of the ancient philosophers whatever seemed serviceable to their purposes, although later critics had proved that those theories were false, as, for example, the theories of atoms and of a vacuum. They believed that the discussions of those authors were of a general character and contained propositions useful for the defense of positive religion. At a subsequent period, the same theories were more fully developed and presented an aspect unknown to those theologians of the Greeks and other nations who were the immediate successors of the philosophers. At a later time, when the Mohammedans adopted certain peculiar theological theories, they were naturally obliged to defend them, and when their new theories again became the subject of controversy among them, each party laid down such propositions as suited their special doctrine. Their arguments undoubtedly involved certain principles which concerned the three communities, Jews, Christians, and Mohammedans, such as the creatio ex nihilo, which afforded support to the belief in miracles and to various other doctrines. There are, however, other subjects of belief which the Christians and Mohammedans have undertaken to defend, such as the doctrine of the Trinity in the theological works of the former, and the Word in the works of some Mohammedan sects. In order to prove the dogmas which they thus desired to establish, they were compelled to resort to certain hypotheses. It is not our object to criticize things which are peculiar to either creed, or books which were written exclusively in the interest of the one community or the other. We merely maintain that the earlier theologians, both of the Greek Christians and of the Mohammedans, when they laid down their propositions, did not investigate the real properties of things. First of all, they considered what must be the properties of the things which should yield proof for or against a certain creed. And when this was found, they asserted that the thing must be endowed with those properties. Then they employed the same assertion as a proof for the identical arguments which had led to the assertion, and by which they either supported or refuted a certain opinion. This course was followed by able men who originated this method and adopted it in their writings. They professed to be free from preconceived opinions and to have been led to a stated result by actual research. Therefore, when philosophers of a subsequent date studied the same writings, they did not perceive the true character of the arguments. On the contrary, they found in the ancient works strong proofs and a valuable support for the acceptance or rejection of certain opinions, and thus thought that so far as religious principles were concerned, there was no necessity whatever to prove or refute any of their propositions, and that the first mutakallimim had discussed those subjects with the sole object of defeating certain views of the philosophers and demonstrating the insufficiency of their proofs. Persons who hold this opinion do not suspect how much they are mistaken, for the first mutakallimim tried to prove a proposition when it was expedient to demonstrate its truth, and to disprove it when its rejection was desirable, and when it was contrary to the opinion which they wished to uphold, although the contradiction might only become obvious after the application of 100 successive propositions. In this manner the earlier mutakallimim effected a radical cure of the malady. I tell you, however, as a general rule, that Themistius was right in saying that the properties of things cannot adapt themselves to our opinions, but our opinions must be adapted to the existing properties. Having studied the works of these mutakallimim as far as I had an opportunity, just as I had studied the writings of the philosophers according to the best of my ability, I found that the method of all mutakallimim was the same in its general characteristics, namely, they assume that the really existing form of things proves nothing at all, because it is merely one of various phases of the things, the opposite of which is equally admissible to our minds. In many instances, these theologians were guided by their imagination, and thought that they were following the dictates of the intellect. They set forth the propositions which I shall describe to you, and demonstrated by their peculiar mode of arguing that the universe had a beginning. The theory of the creatio ex nihilo being thus established, they asserted, as a logical consequence, that undoubtedly there must be a Maker who created the universe. Next, they showed that this Maker is one, and from the unity of the Creator they deduced his incorporeality. This method was adopted by every Mohammedan mutakallim in the discussion of this subject, and by those of our co-religionists who imitated them and walked in their footsteps. Although the mutakallimim disagree in the methods of their proofs and employ different propositions in demonstrating the act of creation or in rejecting the eternity of the universe, they invariably begin with proving the creatio ex nihilo, and establish on that proof the existence of God. I have examined this method and find it most objectionable. It must be rejected, because all the proofs for the creation have weak points, and cannot be considered as convincing except by those who do not know the difference between a proof, a dialectical argument, and a sophism. Those who understand the force of the different methods will clearly see that all the proofs for the creation are questionable, because propositions have been employed which have never been proved. I think that the utmost that can be effected by believers in the truth of revelation is to expose the shortcomings in the proofs of philosophers who hold that the universe is eternal, and if forsooth a man has effected this, he has accomplished a great deed. For it is well known to all clear and correct thinkers who do not wish to deceive themselves, that this question, namely, whether the universe has been created or is eternal, cannot be answered with mathematical certainty. Here human intellect must pause. We shall have occasion to speak more fully on this subject, but for the present it may suffice to say that the philosophers have for the last 3,000 years been continually divided on that subject, as far as we can learn from their works and the record of their opinions. Such being the nature of this theory, how can we employ it as an axiom and establish on it the existence of the Creator? In that case, the existence of God would be uncertain. If the universe had a beginning, God does exist. If it be eternal, God does not exist. The existence of God would therefore remain either an open question, or we should have to declare that the creation had been proved, and compel others by mere force to accept this doctrine, in order thus to be enabled to declare that we have proved the existence of God. Such a process is utterly inadmissible. The true method, which is based on a logical and indubitable proof, consists, according to my opinion, in demonstrating the existence of God, His unity, and His incorporeality, by such philosophical arguments as are founded on the theory of the eternity of the universe. I do not propose this method as though I believed in the eternity of the universe, for I do not follow the philosophers on this point, but because by the aid of this method these three principles, viz., the existence of God, His unity, and His incorporeality, can be fully proved and verified, irrespectively of the question whether the universe had a beginning or not. After firmly establishing these three principles by an exact proof, we shall treat of the problem of creation, and discuss it as fully as possible. You are at liberty to content yourself with the declaration of the Mutakalimim, and to believe that the act of creation has been demonstrated by proof, nor can there be any harm, if you consider it unproven that the universe had a beginning, and accept this theory as supported by the authority of the prophets. Before you learn our opinion on prophecy, which will be given in the present work, do not ask how could the belief in prophecy be justified if it were assumed that the universe was eternal. We will not now expatiate on that subject. You should, however, know that some of the propositions started and proved by the radicals, that is, the Mutakalimim, in order to prove the act of creation, imply an order of things contrary to that which really exists, and involve a complete change in the laws of nature. This fact will be pointed out to you, for it will be necessary to mention their propositions and their argumentation. My method, as far as I can now explain it, in general terms, is as follows. The universe is either eternal or has had a beginning. If it had a beginning, there must necessarily exist a being which caused the beginning. This is clear to common sense. For a thing that has had a beginning cannot be the cause of its own beginning. Another must have caused it. The universe was, therefore, created by God. If, on the other hand, the universe were eternal, it could in various ways be proved that apart from the things which constitute the universe, there exists a being which is neither body nor a force in a body, and which is one, eternal, not preceded by any cause, and immutable. That being is God. You see that the proofs for the existence, the unity, and the incorporeality of God must vary according to the propositions admitted by us. Only in this way can we succeed in obtaining a perfect proof, whether we assume the eternity or the creation of the universe. For this reason, you will find in my works on the Talmud, whenever I have to speak of the fundamental principles of our religion or to prove the existence of God, that I employ arguments which imply the eternity of the universe. I do not believe in that eternity, but I wish to establish the principle of the existence of God by an indisputable proof, and should not like to see this most important principle founded on a basis which everyone could shake or attempt to demolish, and which others might consider as not being established at all, especially when I see that the proofs of the philosophers are based on those visible properties of things which can only be ignored by persons possessing certain preconceived notions, while the Mutakalimim establish their arguments on propositions which are to such an extent contrary to the actual state of things as to compel these arguers to deny altogether the existence of the laws of nature. When I shall have to treat of the creation, I shall in a special chapter prove my opinion to some extent, and shall attain the same end which every one of the Mutakalamim had in view. Yet I shall not contradict the laws of nature, or reject any such part of the Aristotelian theory as has been proved to be correct. Even the most cogent of the proofs offered by the Mutakalamim respecting the act of creation has only been obtained by reversing the whole order of things and by rejecting everything fully demonstrated by the philosophers. I, however, shall be able to give a similar proof without ignoring the laws of nature and without being forced to contradict facts which have been clearly perceived. I find it necessary to mention to you the general propositions of the Mutakalamim by which they prove the act of creation, the existence of God, his unity, and his incorporeality. I intend to explain their method and also to point out the inferences which are to be drawn from each proposition. After this, I shall describe those theories of the philosophers which are closely connected with our subject, and I shall then explain their method. Do not ask me to prove in this work the propositions of the philosophers, which I shall briefly mention to you. They form the principal part of physics and metaphysics, nor must you expect that I should repeat the arguments of the Mutakalamim in support of their propositions, with which they wasted their time, with which the time of future generations will likewise be wasted, and on which numerous books have been written. Their propositions, with few exceptions, are contradicted by the visible properties of things, and beset with numerous objections. For this reason they were obliged to write many books and controversial works in defense of their theories, for the refutation of objections, and for the reconciliation of all apparent contradictions, although in reality this object cannot be attained by any sophistical contrivance. As to the propositions of the philosophers, which I shall briefly explain, and which are indispensable for the demonstration of the three principles, the existence, the unity, and the incorporeality of God, they will for the greater part be admitted by you as soon as you shall hear them and understand their meaning, whilst in the discussion of other parts reference must be made for their proofs to works on physics and metaphysics. And if you direct your attention to such passages as will be pointed out to you, you will find everything verified that requires verification. I have already told you that nothing exists except God and this universe, and that there is no other evidence for his existence but this universe in its entirety and in its several parts. Consequently, the universe must be examined as it is. The propositions must be derived from those properties of the universe which are clearly perceived, and hence you must know its visible form and its nature. Then only will you find in the universe evidence for the existence of a being not included therein. I have considered it, therefore, necessary to discuss first in a merely colloquial manner, in the next chapter, the totality of existing things, and to confine our remarks to such as have been fully proved and established beyond all doubt. In subsequent chapters I shall treat of the propositions of the Mutakalamim, and describe the method by which they explain the four fundamental principles. In the chapters which will follow, I propose to expound the propositions of the philosophers, and the methods applied by them in verifying those principles. In the last place, I shall explain to you the method applied by me in proving those four principles as I have stated to you. End of chapter 71. Read by Czandra.
Part 1, Chapter 72 of God for the Perplexed. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Guide for the Perplexed by Moses Maimonides, translated by Michael Friedländer. Chapter 72. Know that this universe, in its entirety, is nothing else but one individual being. That is to say, the outermost heavenly sphere, together with all included therein, is as regards individuality beyond all question a single being, like Set and Omar. The variety of its substances, I mean the substances of that sphere and all its component parts, is like the variety of the substances of a human being. Just as, e.g., Set is one individual consisting of various solid substances, such as flesh, bones, sinews, of various humors, and of various spiritual elements. In like manner, the sphere in its totality is composed of the celestial orbs, the four elements and their combinations. There is no vacuum whatever therein. but the whole space is filled up with matter. Its center is occupied by the earth is surrounded by water, air encompasses the water, fire envelops the air, and this again is enveloped by the fifth substance, quintessence. These substances form numerous spheres, one being enclosed within another, so that no intermediate empty space, no vacuum, is left. One sphere surrounds and closely joins the other. All the spheres revolve with constant uniformity, without acceleration or retardation. That is to say, each sphere retains its individual nature as regards its velocity and the peculiarity of its motion. It does not move at one time quicker, at another slower. Compared with each other, however, some of the spheres move with less, others with greater velocity. The outermost, all-encompassing sphere revolves with the greatest speed. It completes its revolution in one day, and causes everything to participate in its motion, just as every particle of a thing moves when the entire body is in motion. For existing beings stand in the same relation to that sphere as a part of the thing stands to the whole. These spheres have not a common center. The centers of some of them are identical with the center of the universe, while those of the rest are different from it. Some of the spheres have a motion independent of that of the whole universe, constantly revolving from east to west, while other spheres move from west to east. The stars contained in those spheres are part of their respective orbits. They are fixed in them, and have no motion of their own, but participating in the motion of the sphere of which they are a part, they appear themselves to move. The entire substance of this revolving fifth element is unlike the substance of those bodies which consist of the other four elements, and are enclosed by the fifth element. The number of these spheres encompassing the universe cannot possibly be less than 18. It may even be larger, but this is a matter for further investigation. It also remains an open question whether there are spheres which, without moving round the center of the universe, have nevertheless a circular motion. Within that sphere which is nearest to us, a substance is contained which is different from the substance of the fifth element. It first received four primary forms, and then became in these four forms four kinds of matter: earth, water, air, fire. Each of these four elements occupies a certain position of its own assigned to it by nature. It is not found in another place. So long as no other but its own natural force acts upon it, it is a dead body. It has no life, no perception, no spontaneous motion, and remains at rest in its natural place. When moved from its place by some external force, it returns towards its natural place as soon as that force ceases to operate. For the elements have the property of moving back to their place in a straight line, but they have no properties which would cause them to remain where they are, or to move otherwise than in a straight line. The rectilinear motions of these four elements when returning to their original place are of two kinds, either centrifugal, viz., the motion of the air and the fire, or centripetal, viz., the motion of the earth and the water. And when the elements have reached their original place, they remain at rest. The spherical bodies, on the other hand, have life, possess a soul by which they move spontaneously. They have no properties by which they could at any time come to a state of rest. In their perpetual rotations they are not subject to any change, except that of position. The question whether they are endowed with an intellect, enabling them to comprehend, cannot be solved without deep research. Through the constant revolution of the fifth element, with all contained therein, the four elements are forced to move and to change their respective positions, so that fire and air are driven into the water, and again these three elements enter the depth of the earth. Thus are the elements mixed together, and when they return to their respective places, parts of the earth, in quitting their places, move together with the water, the air, and the fire. In this whole process the elements act and react upon each other. The elements intermixed are then combined and form at first various kinds of vapors, afterwards the several kinds of minerals, every species of plants, and many species of living beings, according to the relative proportion of the constituent parts. All transient beings have their origin in the elements, into which again they resolve when their existence comes to an end. The elements themselves are subject to being transformed from one into another, for although one substance is common to all, substance without form is in reality impossible, just as the physical form of these transient beings cannot exist without substance. the formation and the dissolution of the elements, together with the things composed of them, and resolving into them, follow each other in rotation. The changes of the finite substance, in successively receiving one form after the other, may therefore be compared to the revolution of the sphere in space, when each part of the sphere periodically reappears in the same position. As the human body consists both of principal organs and of other members which depend on them and cannot exist without the control of those organs, so does the universe consist both of principal parts, viz. The quintessence, which encompasses the four elements, and of other parts which are subordinated and require a leader, viz. The four elements and the things composed of them. Again, the principal part in the human body, namely the heart, is in constant motion, and is the source of every motion noticed in the body. It rules over the other members and communicates to them through its own pulsations the force required for their functions. The outermost sphere by its motion rules in a similar way over all other parts of the universe, and supplies all things with their special properties. Every motion in the universe has thus its origin in the motion of that sphere, and the soul of every animated being derives its origin from the soul of that same sphere. The forces which according to this explanation are communicated by the spheres to the sublunary world are four in number, viz. A. The force which affects the mixture and the composition of the elements, and which undoubtedly suffices to form the minerals. B. The force which supplies every growing thing with its vegetative functions. C. The force which gives to each living being its vitality. And D. The force which endows rational beings with intellect. All this is effected through the action of light and darkness, which are regulated by the position and the motion of the spheres around the earth. When, for one instant, the beating of the heart is interrupted, man dies, and all his motions and powers come to an end. In a like manner would the whole universe perish, and everything therein cease to exist if the spheres were to come to a standstill. The living being, as such, is one through the action of its heart, although some parts of the body are devoid of motion and sensation, as, e.g., the bones, the cartilage, and similar parts. The same is the case with the entire universe. Although it includes many beings without motion and without life, it is a single being living through the motion of the sphere, which may be compared to the heart of an animated being. You must therefore consider the entire globe as one individual being which is endowed with life, motion, and a soul. This mode of considering the universe is, as will be explained, indispensable. That is to say, it is very useful for demonstrating the unity of God. It also helps to elucidate the principle that he who is one has created only one being. Again, it is impossible that any of the members of a human body should exist by themselves, not connected with the body, and at the same time should actually be organic parts of the body. That is to say, that the liver should exist by itself, the heart by itself, or the flesh by itself. In like manner, it is impossible that one part of the universe should exist independently of the other parts in the existing order of things as here considered, viz., that the fire should exist without the coexistence of the earth, or the earth without the heaven, or the heaven without the earth. In man there is a certain force which unites members of the body, controls them, and gives to each of them what it requires for the conservation of its condition, and for the repulsion of injury the physicians distinctly call it the leading force in the body of the living being. Sometimes they call it nature. The universe likewise possesses a force which unites the several parts with each other, protects the species from destruction, maintains the individuals of each species as long as possible, and endows some individual beings with permanent existence. Whether this force operates through the medium of the sphere or otherwise remains an open question. Again, in the body of each individual there are parts which are intended for a certain purpose, as the organs of nutrition for the preservation of the individual, the organs of generation for the preservation of the species, the hands and eyes for administering to certain wants, as to food, etc. There are also parts which, in themselves, are not intended for any purpose, but are mere accessories and adjuncts to the constitution of the other parts. The peculiar constitution of the organs, indispensable for the conservation of their particular forms and for the performance of their primary functions, produces, whilst it serves its special purpose, according to the nature of the substance, other things, such as the hair and the complexion of the body. Being mere accessories, they are not formed according to a fixed rule. Some are altogether absent in many individuals, and very considerably in others. This is not the case with the organs of the body. You never find that the liver of one person is 10 times larger than that of another person, but you may find a person without a beard, or without hair on certain parts of his body, or with a beard 10 times longer than that of another man. Instances of this phenomenon, viz., great variation as regards hair and color, are not rare. The same differences occur in the constitution of the universe. Some species exist as an integral part of the whole system. These are constant and follow a fixed law. Though they vary as far as their nature permits, this variation is insignificant in quantity and quality. Other species do not serve any purpose. They are the mere result of the general nature of transient things, as, e.g., the various insects which are generated in dunghills, the animals generated in rotten fruit or in fetid liquids, and worms generated in the intestines, etc. In short, everything devoid of the power of generation belongs to this class. You will therefore find that these things do not follow a fixed law, although their entire absence is just as impossible as the absence of different complexions and of different kinds of hair amongst human beings. In man there are substances the individual existence of which is permanent, and there are other substances which are only constant in the species, not the individuals, as, e.g., the 4 humors. The same is the case in the universe. There are substances which are constant in individuals, such as the 5th element, which is constant in all its formations, and other substances which are constant in the species, as, e.g., the 4 elements and all that is composed of them. The same forces which operate in the birth and the temporal existence of the human being operate also in his destruction and death. This truth holds good with regard to this whole transient world. The causes of production are at the same time the causes of destruction. This may be illustrated by the following example. If the 4 forces which are present in every being sustained by food, viz., attraction, retention, digestion, and secretion, were, like intelligent forces, able to combine themselves to what is necessary and to act at the proper time and within the proper limits, man would be exempt from those great sufferings and the numerous diseases to which he is exposed. Since, however, such is not the case, and since the forces perform their natural functions without thought and intelligence, without any consciousness of their action, they necessarily cause dangerous maladies and great pains, although they are the direct cause of the birth and the temporal existence of the human being. This fact is to be explained as follows. If the attractive force would absorb nothing but that which is absolutely beneficial, and nothing but the quantity which is required, man would be free from many such sufferings and disorders. But such is not the case. The attractive force absorbs any humor that comes within range of its action. Although such humor be ill-adapted in quality or in quantity, it is, therefore, natural that sometimes a humor is absorbed which is too warm, too cold, too thick, or too thin, or that too much humor is absorbed, and thus the veins are choked, obstruction and decay ensue. The quality of the humor is deteriorated, its quantities altered, diseases are originated, such as scurvy, leprosy, abscess, or a dangerous illness, such as cancer, elephantiasis, gangrene, and at last the organ or organs are destroyed. The same is the case with every one of the 4 forces, and with all existing beings. The same force that originates all things, and causes them to exist for a certain time, namely, the combination of the elements which are moved and penetrated by the forces of the heavenly spheres, that same cause becomes throughout the world a source of calamities, such as devastating rain, showers, snowstorms, hail, hurricanes, thunder, lightning, malaria, or other terrible catastrophes, by which a place or many places, or an entire country may be laid waste, such as landslips, earthquakes, meteoric showers, and floods issuing forth from the seas and from the interior of the earth. Bear in mind, however, that in all we have noticed about the similarity between the universe and the human being, nothing would warrant us to assert that man is a microcosm. For although the comparison in all its parts applies to the universe and any living being in its normal state, we never heard that any ancient author called the ass or the horse a microcosm. This attribute has been given to man alone on account of his peculiar faculty of thinking. I mean the intellect, viz., the hylic intellect which appertains to no other living being. This may be explained as follows. An animal does not require for its sustenance any plan, thought, or scheme. Each animal moves and acts by its nature, eats as much as it can find of suitable things. It makes its resting place wherever it happens to be, cohabits with any mate it meets while in heat in the periods of its sexual excitement. In this manner does each individual conserve itself for a certain time, and perpetuates the existence of its species without requiring for its maintenance the assistance or support of any of its fellow creatures. For all the things to which it has to attend it performs by itself. With man it is different. If an individual had a solitary existence, and were, like an animal, left without guidance, he would soon perish. He would not endure even one day, unless it were by mere chance, unless he happened to find something upon which he might feed. For the food which man requires for his subsistence demands much work and preparation, which can only be accomplished by reflection and by plan. Many vessels must be used, and many individuals, each in his peculiar work, must be employed. It is therefore necessary that one person should organize the work and direct men in such a manner that they should properly cooperate, and that they should assist each other. The protection from heat in summer and from cold in winter, and shelter from rain, snow, and wind, require in the same manner the preparation of many things, none of which can properly be done without design and thought. For this reason man has been endowed with intellectual faculties which enable him to think, consider, and act, and by various labors to prepare and procure for himself food, dwelling, and clothing, and to control every organ of his body, causing both the principal and the secondary organs to perform their respective functions. Consequently, if a man, being deprived of his intellectual faculties, only possessed vitality, he would in a short time be lost. The intellect is the highest of all faculties of living creatures. It is very difficult to comprehend, and its true character cannot be understood as easily as man's other faculties. There also exists in the universe a certain force which controls the whole, which sets in motion the chief and principal parts, and gives them the motive power for governing the rest. Without that force, the existence of this sphere, with its principal and secondary parts, would be impossible. It is the source of the existence of the universe in all its parts. That force is God. Blessed be his name. It is on account of this force that man is called microcosm, for he likewise possesses a certain principle which governs all the forces of the body, and on account of this comparison God is called the life of the universe. Comp. And he swore by the life of the universe. Dan. 12:7. You must understand that in the parallel which we have drawn between the whole universe on the one hand, and the individual man on the other, there is a complete harmony in all the points which we mentioned above. Only in the following 3 points a discrepancy may be noticed. First, the principal organ of any living being which has a heart derives a benefit from the organs under the control of the heart, and the benefits of the organs thus become the benefits of the heart. This is not the case in the constitution of the universe. That part which bestows authority or distributes power does not receive in return any benefit from the things under its control. Whatever it grants, it is granted in the manner of a generous benefactor, not from any selfish motive, but from a natural generosity and kindliness, only for the sake of imitating the ways of the Most High. Secondly, living creatures endowed with a heart have it within the body, and in the midst thereof. There it is surrounded by organs which it governs. Thus it derives a benefit from them, for they guard and protect it, and they do not allow that any injury from without should approach it. The reverse occurs in the case of the universe. The superior part encompasses the inferior parts, it being certain that it cannot be affected by the action of any other being, and even if it could be affected, there is nobody without it that could affect it. While it influences all that is contained within, it is not influenced by any act or force of any material being. There is, however, some similarity between the universe and man in this point. In the body of animals, the organs more distant from the principal organ are of less importance than those nearer to it. Also in the universe, the nearer the parts are to the center, the greater is their turbidness, their solidity, their inertness, their dimness and darkness, because they are further away from the loftiest element, from the source of light and brightness, which moves by itself and the substance of which is the most rarefied and simplest, from the outermost sphere. At the same ratio at which a body is nearer this sphere, it derives properties from it, and rises above the spheres below it. Thirdly, The faculty of thinking is a force inherent in the body, and is not separated from it. But God is not a force inherent in the body of the universe, but is separate from all its parts. How God rules the universe and provides for it is a complete mystery. Man is unable to solve it. For, on the one hand, it can be proved that God is separate from the universe, and in no contact whatever with it. But, on the other hand, his rule and providence can be proved to exist in all parts of the universe, even in the smallest. Praised be he whose perfection is above our comprehension. It is true, we might have compared the relation between God and the universe to the relation between the absolute acquired intellect and man. It is not a power inherent in the body, but a power which is absolutely separate from the body, and is from without brought into contact with the body. The rational faculty of man may be further compared to the intelligence of the spheres, which are, as it were, material bodies. But the intelligence of the spheres, purely spiritual beings, as well as man's absolute and acquired intellect, are subjects of deep study and research. The proof of their existence, though correct, is abstruse, which includes arguments which present doubts, are exposed to criticism, and can be easily attacked by objectors. We have, therefore, preferred to illustrate the relation of God to the universe by a simile which is clear, and which will not be contradicted in any of the points which have been laid down by us without any qualification. The opposition can only emanate either from an ignorant man, who contradicts truths even if they are perfectly obvious, just as a person unacquainted with geometry rejects elementary propositions which have been clearly demonstrated, or from the prejudiced man who deceives himself. Those, however, who wish to study the subject must persevere in their studies until they are convinced that all our observations are true, and until they understand that our account of this universe unquestionably agrees with the existing order of things. If a man is willing to accept this theory from one who understands how to prove things which can be proved, let him accept it, and let him establish on it his arguments and proofs. If, on the other hand, he refuses to accept without proof even the foregoing principles, let him inquire for himself, and ultimately he will find that they are correct. Lo this, we have searched it, so it is. Hear it, and know thou it for thy good. Job 5:27. After these preliminary remarks, we will treat of the subject which we promised to introduce and to explain. End of Part 1, Chapter 72.
Section 73 of the Guide for the Perplexed. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Guide for the Perplexed by Moses Maimonides, translated by Michael Friedländer. Part 1, Chapter 73. The Chalam. There are 12 propositions common to all mutachalamim, however different their individual opinions and methods may be. The mutachalamim require them in order to establish their views on the four principles. I shall first enumerate these propositions and then discuss each separately, together with the inferences which may be drawn from it. Proposition 1. All things are composed of atoms. Proposition 2. There is a vacuum. Proposition 3. Time is composed of time atoms. Proposition 4. Substance cannot exist without numerous accidents. Proposition 5. Each atom is completely furnished with the accidents which I will describe, and cannot exist without them. Proposition 6. Accidents do not continue in existence during two time atoms. Proposition 7. Both positive and negative properties have a real existence and are accidents which owe their existence to some causa efficiens. Proposition 8. All existing things, that is, all creatures, consist of substance and of accidents, and the physical form of a thing is likewise an accident. Proposition 9. No accident can form the substratum for another accident. Proposition 10. The test for the possibility of an imagined object does not consist in its conformity with the existing laws of nature. Proposition 11. The idea of the infinite is equally inadmissible, whether the infinite be actual, potential, or accidental. That is, there is no difference whether the infinite be formed by a number of coexisting things, or by a series of things, of which one part comes into existence when another has ceased to exist, in which case it is called accidental infinite. In both cases, the infinite is rejected by the Mutakalamim as fallacious. Proposition 12. The senses mislead and are in many cases inefficient. Their perceptions, therefore, cannot form the basis of any law or yield data for any proof. First proposition, quote, the universe, that is, everything contained in it, is composed of very small parts, atoms, which are indivisible on account of their smallness, and such an atom has no magnitude. But when several atoms combine, the sum has a magnitude, and thus forms a body. End quote. If therefore two atoms were joined together, each atom would become a body, and they would thus form two bodies, a theory which in fact has been proposed by some Mutakalamim. All these atoms are perfectly alike. They do not differ from each other in any point. The Mutakalamim further assert that it is impossible to find a body that is not composed of such equal atoms which are placed side by side. According to this view, genesis and composition are identical. Destruction is the same as decomposition. They do not use the term destruction, for they hold that genesis implies composition and decomposition, motion and rest. These atoms, they believe, are not, as was supposed by Epicurus and other atomists, numerically constant, but are created anew whenever it pleases the Creator. Their annihilation is therefore not impossible. Now I will explain to you their opinion concerning the vacuum. Second proposition, on the vacuum. The original Mutakalamim also believes that there is a vacuum, that is, one space, or several spaces which contain nothing, which are not occupied by anything whatsoever, and which are devoid of all substance. This proposition is to them an indispensable sequel to the first, for if the universe were full of such atoms, how could any of them move? For it is impossible to conceive that one atom should move into another, and yet the composition as well as the decomposition of things can only be effected by the motion of atoms. Thus the Mutakalamim are compelled to assume a vacuum, in order that the atoms may combine, separate, and move in that vacuum which does not contain anything or any atom. Third proposition, quote, time is composed of time atoms, end quote. That is, of many parts which on account of their short duration cannot be divided. This proposition also is a logical consequence of the first. The Mutakalamim undoubtedly saw how Aristotle proved that time, space, and locomotion are of the same nature. That is to say, they can be divided into parts which stand in the same proportion to each other. If one of them is divided, the other is divided in the same proportion. They therefore knew that if time were continuous and divisible, ad infinitum, their assumed atom of space would of necessity likewise be divisible. Similarly, if it were supposed that space is continuous, it would necessarily follow that the time element which they considered to be indivisible could also be divided. This has been shown by Aristotle in the treatise called Acroasis. Hence they concluded that space was not continuous, but was composed of elements that could not be divided, and that time could likewise be reduced to time elements which were indivisible. An hour is, for example, divided into 60 minutes, the minute into 60 seconds, the second into 60 parts, and so on. At last, after 10 or more successive divisions by 60, time elements are obtained which are not subjected to division, and in fact are indivisible, just as in the case with space. Time would thus be an object of position and order. The Mutakalamim did not at all understand the nature of time. This is a matter of course, for if the greatest philosophers became embarrassed when they investigated the nature of time, if some of them were altogether unable to comprehend what time really was, and if even Galenus declared time to be something divine and incomprehensible, what can be expected of those who do not regard the nature of things? Now, mark what conclusions were drawn from these three propositions and were accepted by the Mutakallimim as true. They held that locomotion consisted in the translation of each atom of a body from one point to the next one. Accordingly, the velocity of one body in motion cannot be greater than that of another body. When, nevertheless, two bodies are observed to move during the same time through different spaces, the cause of this difference is not attributed by them to the fact that the body which has moved through a larger distance had a greater velocity, but to the circumstance that motion, which in ordinary language is called slow, has been interrupted by more moments of rest, while the motion which ordinarily is called quick has been interrupted by fewer moments of rest. When it is shown that the motion of an arrow which is shot from a powerful bow is in contradiction to their theory, they declare that in this case too the motion is interrupted by moments of rest. They believe that it is the fault of man's senses if he believes that the arrow moves continuously, for there are many things which cannot be perceived by the senses, as they assert in the 12th proposition. But we ask them, quote, "Have you observed a complete revolution of a millstone? Each point in the extreme circumference of the stone describes a large circle in the very same time in which a point nearer the center describes a small circle. The velocity of the outer circle is therefore greater than that of the inner circle. You cannot say that the motion of the latter was interrupted by more moments of rest, for the whole moving body, that is the millstone, is one coherent body." End quote. They reply, quote, "During the circular motion, the parts of the millstone separate from each other, and the moments of rest interrupting the motion of the portions nearer the center are more than those which interrupt the motion of the outer portions." End quote. We ask again, quote, "How is it that the millstone, which we perceive as one body and which cannot be easily broken, even with a hammer, resolves into its atoms when it moves, and becomes again one coherent body, returning to its previous state as soon as it comes to rest, while no one is able to notice the breaking up of the stone?" End quote. Again, their reply is based on the 12th proposition, which is to the effect that the perception of the senses cannot be trusted, and thus only the evidence of the intellect is admissible. Do not imagine that you have seen in the foregoing example the most absurd of the inferences which may be drawn from these three propositions. The proposition relating to the existence of a vacuum leads to more preposterous and extravagant conclusions. Nor must you suppose that the foregoing theory concerning motion is less irrational than the proposition resulting from this theory, that the diagonal of a square is equal to one of its sides. And some of the Mutakallimim go so far as to declare that the square is not a thing of real existence. In short, the adoption of the first proposition would be tantamount to the rejection of all that has been proved in geometry. The propositions in geometry would in this respect be divided into two classes. Some would be absolutely rejected, for example those which relate to properties of the incommensurability and the commensurability of lines and planes, to rational and irrational lines, and all other propositions contained in the 10th book of Euclid and in similar works. Other propositions would appear to be only partially correct. For example, the solution of the problem to divide a line into two equal parts, if the line consists of an odd number of atoms. According to the theory of the Mutakallimim, such a line cannot be bisected. Furthermore, in the well-known Book of Problems by the sons of Shakir are contained more than 100 problems, all solved and practically demonstrated. But if there really were a vacuum, not one of these problems could be solved, and many of the waterworks described in that book could not have been constructed. The refutation of such propositions is a mere waste of time. I will now proceed to treat of the other propositions mentioned above. Fourth proposition, quote, "The accidents of things have real existence. They are elements superadded to the substance itself, and no material thing can be without them." End quote. Had this proposition been left by the Mutakallimim in this form, it would have been correct, simple, clear, and indisputable. They have, however, gone further, asserting that a substance which has not the attribute of life must necessarily have that of death, for it must always have one of two contrasting properties. According to their opinion, color, taste, motion or rest, combination or separation, etc., can be predicated of all substances, and if a substance have the attribute of life, it must at the same time possess such other kinds of accidents as wisdom or folly, free will or the reverse, power or weakness, perception or any of its opposites, and in short, the substance must have the one or the other of all correlative accidents appertaining to a living being. Fifth proposition. Quote, the atom is fully provided with all these foregoing accidents and cannot exist if any be wanting. End quote. The meaning of the proposition is this. The Mutakallimim say that each of the atoms created by God must have accidents such as color, smell, motion, or rest, except the accident of quantity. For according to their opinion, an atom has no magnitude, and they do not designate quantity as an accident, nor do they apply to it the laws of accidents. In accordance with this proposition, they do not say, when an accident is noticed in a body, that it is peculiar to the body as such, but that it exists in each of the atoms which form the constituent elements of that body. Exempli gratis. Take a heap of snow. The whiteness does not exist in that heap as a whole, but each atom of the snow is white, and therefore the aggregate of these atoms is likewise white. Similarly, they say that when a body moves, each atom of it moves, and thus the whole body is in motion. Life likewise exists, according to their view, in each atom of a living body. The same is the case, according to their opinion, with the senses. In each atom of the aggregate they notice the faculty of perception. Life, sensation, intellect, and wisdom are considered by them as accidents, like blackness and whiteness, as will be shown in the further discussion of their theory. Concerning the soul, they do not agree. The view most predominant among them is the following. The soul is an accident existing in one of the atoms, of which, for example, man is composed. The aggregate is called a being endowed with a soul, insofar as it includes that atom. Others are of opinion that the soul is composed of ethereal atoms, which have a peculiar faculty by virtue of which they constitute the soul, and that these atoms are mixed with the atoms of the body. Consequently, they maintain that the soul is an accident. As to the intellect, I found that all of them agree in considering it to be an accident joined to one of the atoms which constitute the whole of the intelligent being. But there is a confusion among them about knowledge. They are uncertain whether it is an accident to each of the atoms which form the knowing aggregate, or whether it belongs only to one atom. Both views can be disproved by a reductio ad absurdum when the following facts are pointed out to them. Generally, metals and stones have a peculiar color which is strongly pronounced, but disappears when they're pulverized. Vitriol, which is intensely green, becomes white dust when pounded. This shows that the accident exists only in the aggregate, not in the atoms. This fact is more striking in the following instance. When parts of a living being are cut off, they cease to live, a proof that the accident of life belongs to the aggregate of the living being, not to each atom. In order to meet this objection, they say that the accident is of no duration, but is constantly renewed. In discussing the next proposition, I shall explain their view on this subject. Sixth proposition. Quote, the accidents do not exist during two time atoms. End quote. The sense of the proposition is this. They believe that God creates a substance and simultaneously its accidents, that the Creator is incapable of creating a substance devoid of an accident, for that is impossible. That the essential characteristic of an accident is its incapability of enduring for two periods, for two time atoms, that immediately after its creation it is utterly destroyed, and another accident of the same kind is created. This again is destroyed, and a third accident of the same kind is created, and so on, as long as God is pleased to preserve in that substance this kind of accident. But he can, at his will, create in the same substance an accident of a different kind, and if he were to discontinue the creation and not produce a new accident, that substance would at once cease to exist. This is one of the opinions held by the Mutakallimim. It has been accepted by most of them, and it is the so-called theory of the creation of the accidents. Some of them, however, and they belong to the sect of Mutazila, say that there are accidents which endure for a certain period, and other accidents which do not endure for 2 atoms of time. They do not follow a fixed principle in deciding what class of accidents has and what class has not a certain duration. The object of this proposition is to oppose the theory that there exists a natural force from which each body derives its peculiar properties. They prefer to assume that God himself creates these properties without the intervention of a natural force or of any other agency, a theory which implies that no accident can have any duration. For suppose that certain accidents could endure for a certain period and then cease to exist. The question would naturally be asked, what is the cause of that non-existence? They would not be satisfied with the reply that God, by his will, brought about this non-existence, and non-existence does not at all require any agens whatever. For as soon as the agens leaves off acting, the product of the agens ceases likewise to exist. This is true to some extent. Having thus chosen to establish the theory that there does not exist any natural force upon which the existence or non-existence of a thing depends, they were compelled to assume that the properties of things were successively renewed. When God desires to deprive a thing of its existence, he, according to some of the Mutakallimim, discontinues the creation of its accidents, and eo ipso, the body ceases to exist. Others, however, say that if it pleased the Almighty to destroy the world, he would create the accident of destruction, which would be without any substratum. The destruction of the universe would be the correlative accident to that of existence. In accordance with this 6th proposition, they say that the cloth which, according to our belief, we dyed red, has not been dyed by us at all, but God created that color in the cloth when it came into contact with the red pigment. We believe that color to have penetrated into the cloth, but they assert that this is not the case. They say that God generally acts in such a way that, for example, the black color is not created unless the cloth is brought into contact with indigo, but this blackness which God creates in the instant when the cloth touches the black pigment is of no duration, and another creation of blackness then takes place. They further say that after the blackness is gone, he does not create a red or green color, but again a black color. According to this principle, the knowledge which we have of certain things today is not the same which we had of them yesterday. That knowledge is gone, and another like it has been created. They positively believe that this does take place, knowledge being an accident. In like manner, it would follow that the soul, according to those who believe that it is an accident, is renewed each moment in every animated being, say 100,000 times, for as you know, time is composed of time atoms. In accordance with this principle, they assert that when man is perceived to move a pen, it is not he who has really moved it. The motion produced in the pen is an accident which God has created in the pen. The apparent motion of the hand which moves the pen is likewise an accident which God has created in the moving hand. But the creative act of God is performed in such a manner that the motion of the hand and the motion of the pen follow each other closely, but the hand does not act, and is not the cause of the pen's motion. For as they say, an accident cannot pass from one thing to another. Some of the Mutakallimim accordingly contend that this white cloth, which is colored when put into the vessel filled with indigo, has not been blackened by the indigo, for blackness being an attribute of indigo does not pass from one object to another. There does not exist anything to which an action could be ascribed. The real agens is God, and he has, in the foregoing instance, created the blackness in the substance of the cloth when it came into contact with the indigo, for this is the method adopted by him. In short, most of the Mutakallimim believe that it must never be said that one thing is the cause of another. Some of them who assumed causality were blamed for doing so. As regards, however, the acts of man, their opinions are divided. Most of them, especially the sect of the Ash'ariya, assume that when the pen is set in motion, God has created 4 accidents, none of which is the cause of any of the rest. They are only related to each other as regards the time of their coexistence, and have no other relation to each other. The first accident is man's will to move the pen. The second is man's power to do so. The third is the bodily motion itself, that is, the motion of the hand. And the fourth is the motion of the pen. They believe that when a man has the will to do a thing, and as he believes does it, the will has been created for him, then the power to conform to the will, and lastly, the act itself. The act is not accomplished by the power created in man, for in reality no act can be ascribed to that power. The Mutazila contend that man acts by virtue of the power which has been created in him. Some of the Acharya assert that the power created in man participates in the act and is connected with it, an opinion which has been rejected by the majority of them. The will and the power created in man, according to the concurrent belief of the Mutakalamim, together with the act created in him, according to some of them, are accidents without duration. In the instance of the pen, God continually creates one motion after the other, so long as the pen is in motion. It only then ceases to move when God has created in it the accident of rest. And so long as the pen is at rest, God continually renews in it that accident. Consequently, in every one of these moments, that is, of the time atoms, God creates some accident in every existing individual, for example, in the angels, in the spheres, and in other things. This creation takes place continually and without interruption. Such is, according to their opinion, the right interpretation of the creed that God is the causa efficiens. But I, together with all rational persons, apply to these theories the words, quote, "Will you mock at him as you mock at man?" End quote, for their words are indeed nothing but mockery. Seventh proposition. Quote, "The absence of a property is itself a property that exists in the body, a something superadded to its substance, an actual accident, which is constantly renewed. As soon as it is destroyed, it is reproduced." End quote. The reason why they hold this opinion is this: they do not understand that rest is the absence of motion, death the absence of life, that blindness is the absence of sight, and that all similar negative properties are the absence of the positive correlatives. The relation between motion and rest is, according to their theory, the same as the relation between heat and cold, namely, as heat and cold are two accidents found in two objects which have the properties of heat and cold, so motion is an accident created in the thing which moves, and rest an accident created in the thing which rests. It does not remain in existence during two consecutive time atoms, as we have stated in treating of the previous proposition. Accordingly, when a body is at rest, God has created the rest in each atom of that body, and so long as the body remains at rest, God continually renews that property. The same, they believe, is the case with a man's wisdom and ignorance. The latter is considered by them as an actual accident, which is subject to the constant changes of destruction and creation, so long as there remains a thing of which such a man is ignorant. Death and life are likewise accidents, and as the Mutakalamim distinctly state, life is constantly destroyed and renewed during the whole existence of a living being. When God decrees its death, he creates in it the accident of death after the accident of life, which does not continue during two time atoms, has ceased to exist. All this they state clearly. The logical consequence of this proposition is that the accident of death created by God instantly ceases to exist and is replaced by another death, which again is created by God, otherwise death could not continue. Death is thus continually created in the same manner as life is renewed every moment. But I should wish to know how long God continues to create death in a dead body. Does he do so whilst the form remains, or whilst one of the atoms exists? For in each of the atoms of the body, the accident of death which God creates is produced, and there are to be found teeth of persons who died thousands of years ago. We see that those teeth have not been deprived of existence, and therefore the accident of death has during all these thousands of years been renewed. And according to the opinion prevailing amongst those theorists, death was continually replaced by death. Some of the Mutazila hold that there are cases in which the absence of a physical property is not a real property, that weariness is the absence of strength and ignorance the absence of knowledge, But this cannot be said in every case of negative properties. It cannot be said that darkness is the mere absence of light, or that rest is the absence of motion. Some negative properties are thus considered by them as having a real existence, while other negative properties are considered as non-existing, just as suits their belief. Here they proceed in the same manner as they proceed respecting the duration of accidents, and they contend that some accidents exist a long time, and other accidents do not last 2 time atoms. Their sole object is to fashion the universe according to their peculiar opinions and beliefs. 8th proposition, quote, there exists nothing but substance and accident, and the physical form of things belong to the class of accidents. End quote. It is the object of this proposition to show that all bodies are composed of similar atoms, as we've pointed out in explaining the first proposition. The difference of bodies from each other is caused by the accidents and by nothing else. Animality, humanity, sensibility, and speech are denoted as accidents like blackness, whiteness, bitterness, and sweetness, and the difference between 2 individuals of 2 classes is the same as the difference of 2 individuals of the same class. Also the body of the heaven, the body of the angels, the body of the divine throne, such as it is assumed to be, the body of anything creeping on the earth, and the body of any plant have one and the same substance. They only differ in the peculiarity of the accidents, and in nothing else. The substance of all things is made up of equal atoms. 9th proposition, quote, none of the accidents form the substratum of another accident. It cannot be said, this is an accident to a thing which is itself an accident to a substance. All accidents are directly connected with the substance. End quote. The Mutakallimim deny the indirect relation of the accident to the substance, because if such a relation were assumed, it would follow that the second accident could only exist in the substance after another accident had preceded it, a conclusion to which they would object even with regard to some special accidents. They prefer to show that these accidents can exist in every possible substance, although such substance is not determined by any other accident, for they hold that all the accidents collectively determine the thing. They advance also another proof in support of this proposition, namely, the substratum which is the bearer of certain attributes must continue to exist for a certain time. How then could the accident, which according to their opinion does not remain in existence for 2 moments, become the substratum of something else? 10th proposition. This proposition concerns the theory of admissibility, which is mentioned by the Mutakallimim and forms the principal support of their doctrine. Mark its purport. They observe that everything conceived by the imagination is admitted by the intellect as possible, exempli gratis, that the terrestrial globe should become the all-encompassing sphere, or that the sphere should become the terrestrial globe. Reason does not find here an impossibility, or that the sphere of fire should move towards the center, and the sphere of earth towards the circumference. Human intellect does not perceive any reason why a body should be in a certain place instead of being in another. In the same manner they say that reason admits the possibility that an existing being should be larger or smaller than it really is, or that it should be different in form and position from what it really is. For example, a man might have the height of a mountain, might have several heads and fly in the air, or an elephant might be as small as an insect, or an insect as huge as an elephant. This method of admitting possibilities is applied to the whole universe. Whenever they affirm that a thing belongs to this class of admitted possibilities, they say that it can have this form, and that it is also possible that it be found differently, and that the one form is not more possible than the other. But they do not ask whether the reality confirms their assumption. They say that the thing which exists with certain constant and permanent forms, dimensions, and properties only follows the direction of habit, just as the king generally rides on horseback through the streets of the city, and is never found departing from this habit. But reason does not find it impossible that he should walk on foot through the place. There is no doubt that he may do so, and this possibility is fully admitted by the intellect. Similarly, earth moves towards the center, fire turns away from the center. Fire causes heat, water causes cold, in accordance with a certain habit. But it is logically not impossible that a deviation from this habit should occur, namely that fire should cause cold, move downward, and still be fire, that the water should cause heat, move upward, and still be water. On this foundation their whole fabric is constructed. They admit, however, the impossibility of two opposite properties coexisting at the same time in one substance. This is impossible. Reason would not admit this possibility. Again, reason does not admit the possibility of a substance existing without an accident, or an accident existing without a substance, a possibility admitted by some of the Mutakallimim. It is also impossible that a substance should become an accident, that an accident should become a substance, or that one substance should penetrate another. They admit that reason rejects all these things as impossible. It is perfectly true that no notion whatever can be formed of those things which they describe as impossible, whilst a notion can be formed of those things which they consider as possible. The philosophers object to this method and say, "You call a thing impossible because it cannot be imagined, or possible because it can be imagined, and thus you consider as possible that which is found possible by imagination, not by the intellect. Consequently, you determine that a thing is necessary, possible, or impossible in some instances by the aid of the imagination, not by the intellect, and in other instances by the ordinary common sense, as Abu Nasr says in speaking of that which the Mutakallimim call intellect. It is clear that they describe as possible that which can be imagined, whether the reality correspond to it or not, and as impossible that which cannot be imagined. This proposition can only be established by the 9 aforementioned propositions, and no doubt these were exclusively required for the support of this proposition. This you will see clearly when I shall show and explain to you some important parts of this theory, which I shall now introduce in the form of a discussion supposed to have taken place between a Mutakallim and a philosopher. The Mutakallim said to the philosopher, "What is the reason that we find the substance of iron extremely hard and strong with a dark color, the substance of cream, on the other hand, extremely soft and white?" The philosopher replied as follows: "All physical bodies have two kinds of accidents, those which concern their substance, as, for example, the health and the illness of a man, and those which concern their form, as, for example, the astonishment and laughter of a man. The substances of compound bodies differ very much in their ultimate form, according to the difference of the forms peculiar to each component substance. Hence the substance of iron has become, in its properties, the opposite of the substance of cream, and this difference is attended by the difference of accidents. You notice, therefore, hardness in the one and softness in the other, two accidents whose difference results from the difference which exists in the forms of the substances, while the darkness and the whiteness are accidents whose divergence corresponds to that of the two substances in their ultimate condition." The Mutakallim refuted this reply by means of his propositions, as I am now going to state. There does not exist a form which, as you believe, modifies the substance, and thus causes substances to be different from each other. This difference is exclusively effected by the accidents, according to the theory of the Kalam, which we mentioned in explaining the 8th proposition. He then continued thus: "There is no difference between the substance of iron and that of cream. All things are composed of the same kind of atoms." We explained the view of the Mutakallimim on this point in treating of the first proposition, the logical consequences of which are, as we have shown, the 2nd and the 3rd propositions. They further require the 12th proposition in order to establish the theory of atoms, nor do they admit that any accidents determine the nature of a substance or predispose it to receive certain other accidents, for, according to their opinion, an accident cannot be the substratum of another accident, as we have shown in explaining the 9th proposition, nor can it have any duration, according to the 6th proposition. When the Mutakallimim have established all that they wish to infer from these propositions, they arrive at the conclusion that the component atoms of cream and of iron are alike. The relation of each atom to each of the accidents is the same. One atom is not more adapted than another to receive a certain accident, And as a certain atom is not more fitted to move than to rest, so one atom is not more apt than another to receive the accident of life, of reason, of sensation. It is here of no moment whether a thing contains a larger or smaller quantity of atoms, for according to the view of the Mutakalamim, which we explained in treating of the fifth proposition, every accident of a thing exists in each of its atoms. All these propositions lead to the conclusion that a human being is not better constituted to become wise than the bat, and establish the theory of admissibility expressed in this 10th proposition. Every effort was made to demonstrate this proposition because it is the best means for proving anything they like, as will be explained. Note: mark, O reader, that if you know the nature of the soul and its properties, and if you have a correct notion of everything which concerns the soul, you will observe that most animals possess imagination. As to the higher class of animals, that is, those which have a heart, it is obvious that they have imagination. Man's distinction does not consist in the possession of imagination, and the action of imagination is not the same as the action of the intellect, but the reverse of it. For the intellect analyzes and divides the component parts of things. It forms abstract ideas of them, represents them in their true form as well as in their causal relations, derives from one object a great many facts which, for the intellect, totally differ from each other, just as two human individuals appear different to the imagination. It distinguishes that which is the property of the genus from that which is peculiar to the individual, and no proof is correct unless founded on the former. The intellect further determines whether certain qualities of a thing are essential or non-essential. Imagination has none of these functions. It only perceives the individual, the compound in that aggregate condition in which it presents itself to the senses, or it combines things which exist separately, joins some of them together, and represents them all as one body or as a force of the body. Hence it is that some imagine a man with a horse's head, with wings, etc. This is called a fiction, a phantasm. It is a thing to which nothing in the actual world corresponds. Nor can imagination in any way obtain a purely immaterial image of an object, however abstract the form of the image may be. Imagination yields therefore no test for the reality of a thing. Hear what profit we derive from the preliminary disciplines, and how excellent the propositions are which we learn through them. Know that there are certain things which would appear impossible if tested by a man's imagination, being as inconceivable as the coexistence of two opposite properties in one object. Yet the existence of those same things which cannot be represented by imagination is nevertheless established by proof and attested by their reality. For example, imagine a large globe, of any magnitude you like, even as large as the all-encompassing sphere. Further, an axis passing through the center, and two persons standing on the two extremities of the axis in such a manner that their feet are in the same straight line with the axis, which may be either in the plane of the horizon or not. In the first case, both persons would fall. In the second case, one, namely the one who stands on the lower extremity, would fall. The other would remain standing as far as our imagination can perceive. It has, however, already been proved that the earth has the form of a globe, that it is inhabited on both extremities of a certain diameter, that both the inhabitants have their heads towards the heaven and their legs towards each other, and yet neither can possibly fall, nor can it be imagined. For it is incorrect to say that the one extremity is above, the other below, but the term above and below apply to both of them as regards their relative position to each other. Similarly, it has been proved in the second chapter of the book on conic sections that two lines which at first are at a certain distance from each other may approach each other in the same proportion as they are produced further, and yet would never meet, even if they were produced to infinity, although they are observed to be constantly converging. This is a fact which cannot easily be conceived, and which does not come within the scope of imagination. Of these two lines, the one is straight, the other curved, as stated in the aforementioned book. It has consequently been proved that things which cannot be perceived or imagined, and which would be found impossible if tested solely by imagination, are nevertheless in real existence. The non-existence of things which are represented by imagination as possible has likewise been established by proof, for example, the corporeality of God, and his existence as a force residing in a body. Imagination perceives nothing except bodies or properties inherent in bodies. It has thus been clearly shown that in man exists a certain faculty which is entirely distinct from imagination, and by which the necessary, the possible, and the impossible can be distinguished from each other. This inquiry is most useful. It is of the greatest profit to him who desires to guard himself against the errors of men guided by imagination. Do not think that the Mutakallimim ignore this altogether. To some extent they do take it into consideration. They know it and call that which can be imagined without having reality, as for example the corporeality of God, a phantom and a fancy. They state frequently that such phantoms are not real. It is for this reason that they advance the first 9 propositions and establish on them the proof of the 10th, according to which all those imaginable things which they wish to admit as possible are really possible, because of the similarity of all atoms and the equality of all accidents as regards their accidentality, as we've explained. Consider, O reader, and bear in mind that this requires deep research, for there are certain notions which some believe to be founded on reason, while others regard them as mere fictions. In such cases it would be necessary to find something that could show the difference between conceptions of the intellect and mere imaginary fancies. When the philosopher in his way of expressing himself contends, quote, "Reality is my evidence, by its guidance I examine whether a thing is necessary, possible, or impossible," end quote, the religionist replies, quote, "This is exactly the difference between us. That which actually exists has, according to my view, been produced by the will of the Creator, not by necessity. Just as it has been created with that special property, it might have been created with any other property, unless the impossibility which you postulate be proved by a logical demonstration." End quote. About this admissibility of imaginable things, I shall have to say more, and I shall return to it in various parts of this treatise, for it is not a subject which should be rejected in haste and on the spur of the moment. 11th proposition. Quote, "The existence of the infinite is in every respect impossible." End quote. The following is an explanation of this proposition. The impossibility of the existence of an infinite body has been clearly demonstrated. The same can be said of an infinite number of bodies, although each of them be finite, if these beings, infinite in number, exist at the same time. Equally impossible is the existence of an infinite series of causes, namely that a certain thing should be the cause of another thing, but itself the effect of another cause, which again is the result of another cause, and so on to infinity, or that things in an infinite series, either bodies or ideals, should be in actual existence, and in causal relation to each other. This causal relation is the essential order of nature, in which, as has been fully proved, the infinite is impossible. As regards the virtual and the accidental existence of the infinite, it has been established in some cases. It has been proved, for example, that body can virtually be divided ad infinitum, also that time can be divided ad infinitum. In other cases, it is still an open question, as for example the existence of the infinite in succession, which is called the accidental infinite, that is, a series of things in which one thing comes forth when the other is gone, and this again in its turn succeeded a thing which had ceased to exist, and so on ad infinitum. This subject requires deep research. Those who boast that they have proved the eternity of the universe say that time is infinite, an assertion which is not necessarily erroneous, for only when one atom has ceased to exist the other follows. Nor is it absolutely wrong when they assert that the accidents of the substance succeed each other in an infinite series, for these accidents do not coexist, but come in succession one after the other, and the impossibility of the infinite in that case has not been proved. The Mutakallimim, however, make no difference between the existence of an infinite body and the divisibility of a body or of time ad infinitum, between the coexistence of an infinite number of things, as for example the individual human beings who exist at present, and the infinite number of beings successively existing, as for example Reuben, the son of Jacob, and Jacob the son of Isaac, and Isaac the son of Abraham, and so on to infinity. This is, according to their opinion, as inadmissible as the first case. They believe these four forms of the infinite to be quite equal. Some of the Mutakallimim endeavor to establish their proposition concerning the last named form of the infinite, and to demonstrate its impossibility by a method which I'll explain in this treatise. Others say that this impossibility is a self-evident axiom and requires no further proof. But if it were undoubtedly wrong to assume that an infinite number of things can exist in succession, although that link of the series which exists at present is finite, the inadmissibility of the eternity of the universe would be equally self-evident, and would not require for its proof any other proposition. This, however, is not the place for investigating the subject. 12th proposition. Quote, the senses are not always to be trusted. End quote. For two reasons the Mutakallimim find fault with the perception of the senses. First, the senses are precluded from perceiving many objects, either on account of the smallness of the objects, this is the case with the atoms as we've already stated, or on account of the remoteness of the objects from the person who desires to perceive them. For example, we cannot see, hear, or smell at a distance of many miles, nor do we perceive the motion of the heavens. Secondly, the senses misapprehend the objects of their perception. A large object appears small from a distance. A small object immersed in water appears larger. A crooked thing appears straight when partly placed in water and partly out of it. Things appear yellow to a person suffering from jaundice. Sweet things are bitter to him whose tongue has imbibed red gall. And they mention many other things of this kind. Therefore, they say, we cannot trust our senses so far as to establish any proof on their perceptions. You must not believe that the Mutakallimim had no purpose in agreeing upon this proposition, or as most of the later adherents of that school affirm, that the first Mutakallimim had no ulterior object in endeavoring to prove the existence of atoms. On the contrary, every proposition here mentioned is indispensable. If one of these be rejected, the whole theory falls to the ground. The last mentioned proposition is of particular importance, for when our senses perceive things by which any of the foregoing propositions are confuted, the Mutakallimim say that no notice should be taken of the perception of the senses so long as the proposition is supported by the testimony of the intellect, and established, as they believe, by proof. Thus they say that the continuous motion is interrupted by moments of rest, that the millstone in its motion is broken into atoms, that the white color of a garment ceases to exist and another whiteness comes in its stead. All these theories are contrary to what the eye perceives, and many inferences are drawn from the assumed existence of a vacuum, all of which are contradicted by the senses. The Mutakallimim, however, meet these objections by saying, whenever they can do so, that the perception of these things is withheld from the senses. In other instances, they maintain that the contradiction has its source in the deceptive character of the senses. You know that this theory is very ancient, and was the pride of the Sophists, who asserted that they themselves were its authors. This is stated by Galenus in his treatise on natural forces, and you know well what he says of those who will not admit the evidence of the senses. Having discussed these propositions, I now proceed to explain the theory of the Mutakallimim concerning the above-mentioned four problems. End of section 73, chapter 73. Read by Sandra. Section 74 of the Guide for the Perplexed. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Guide for the Perplexed by Moses Maimonides, translated by Michael Friedländer. Part 1, Chapter 74. The Chalam. In this chapter will be given an outline of the proofs by which the Mutakallimim attempt to demonstrate that the universe is not eternal. You must of course not expect that I shall quote their lengthy arguments verbatim. I only intend to give an abstract of each proof to show in what way it helps to establish the theory of the creatio ex nihilo, or to confute the eternity of the universe, and briefly to notice the propositions that they employed in support of their theory. If you were to read their well-known and voluminous writings, you would not discover any arguments with which they support their view left unnoticed in the present outline, but you might find there greater copiousness of words combined with more grace and elegance of style. Frequently they employ rhyme, rhythm, and poetical diction, and sometimes mysterious phrases which perhaps are intended to startle persons listening to their discourses, and to deter those who might otherwise criticize them. You would also find many repetitions, questions propounded and, as they believe, answered, and frequent attacks on those who differ from their opinions. The first argument. Some of the Mutakallimim thought that by proving the creation of one thing, they demonstrated the creatio ex nihilo in reference to the entire universe. For example, Zaid, who from a small molecule had gradually been brought to a state of perfection, has undoubtedly not effected this change and development by his own efforts, but owes it to an external agency. It is therefore clear that an agent is required for such organization and successive transmutation. A palm tree or any other object might equally be selected to illustrate this idea. The whole universe, they argue, is analogous to these instances. Thus you see how they believe that a law discovered in one thing may equally be applied to everything. The second argument. This argument is likewise based on the belief that the proof by which the creation of one thing is demonstrated holds good for the creatio ex nihilo in reference to the whole universe. For example, a certain individual called Zaid, who one time was not yet in existence, subsequently came into existence, and if it be assumed that Amr, his father, was the cause of his existence, Amr himself must likewise have passed from non-existence into existence. Suppose then that Zaid's father unquestionably owed his origin to Khaled, Zaid's grandfather. It would be found that Khaled himself did not exist from eternity, and the series of causes could thus be carried back to infinity. But such an infinite series of beings is inadmissible according to the theory of the Mutakallimim, as we have shown in our discussion of the 11th proposition. In continuing this species of reasoning, you come to a first man who had no parent, videlicet Adam. Then you will of course ask, whence came this first man? If, exempli gratia, the reply be given that he was made out of earth, you will again inquire, whence came that earth? Out of water. Whence came the water? The inquiry would be carried on either ad infinitum, which is absurd, or until you meet with something that came into existence from absolute non-existence. In this latter case, you would arrive at the real truth. Here the series of inquiries ends. This result of the question proves, according to the opinion of the Mutakallimim, that the whole universe came into existence from absolute non-existence. The third argument. The atoms of things are necessarily either joined together or separate, and even the same atoms may at one time be united, at another disunited. It is therefore evident that the nature of the atoms does not necessitate either their combination or their separation, for if they were separate by virtue of their nature, they would never join, and if they were joined by virtue of their nature, they could never again be separated. Thus, there is no reason why atoms should rather be combined than separate, or vice versa, why rather in a state of separation than of combination. Seeing that some atoms are joined, others separate, and again others subject to change, they being combined at one time and separated at another, the fact may therefore be taken as proof that the atoms cannot combine or separate without an agent. This argument, according to the opinion of the Mutakallimim, establishes the theory that the universe has been created from nothing. You have already been told that those who employ this argument rely on the first proposition of the Mutakallimim with its corollaries. The fourth argument. The whole universe is composed of substance and accidents. Every substance must possess one accident or more, and since the accidents are not eternal, the substance, the substratum of the accidents, cannot be eternal. For that which is joined to transient things and cannot exist without them is itself transient. Therefore the whole universe has had a beginning. To the objection that the substance may possibly be eternal while the accidents, though in themselves transient, succeed each other in an infinite series, they reply that in this case an infinite number of transient things would be in existence, an eventuality which according to their theory is impossible. This argument is considered by them the best and safest, and has been accepted by many of them as a strict proof. Its acceptance implies the admission of the following three propositions, the object of which is well understood by philosophers. 1. An infinite series of things, of which the one succeeds when the other has ceased to exist, is impossible. 2. All accidents have a beginning. Our opponent, who defends the theory of the eternity of the universe, can refute this proposition by pointing to one particular accident, namely to the circular motion of the sphere, for it is held by Aristotle that this circular motion is eternal, and therefore the spheres which perform this motion are, according to his opinion, likewise eternal. It is of no use to prove that all other accidents have a beginning, for our opponent does not deny this. He says that accidents may supervene an object which has existed from eternity, and may follow each other in rotation. He contents himself with maintaining that this particular accident, vide licet circular motion, the motion of the heavenly sphere, is eternal, and does not belong to the class of transient accidents. It is therefore necessary to examine this accident by itself, and to prove that it is not eternal. 3. The next proposition which the author of this argument accepts is as follows. Every material object consists of substance and accidents, that is to say, of atoms and accidents in the sense in which the Mutakallimim use the term. But if a material object were held to be a combination of matter and form, as has been proved by our opponent, it would be necessary to demonstrate that the primal matter and the primal form are transient, and only then the proof of the creatio ex nihilo would be complete. The fifth argument. This argument is based on the theory of determination, and is made much of by the Mutakallimim. It is the same as the theory which I explained in discussing the 10th proposition, namely, when they treat either of the universe in general or of any of its parts, they assume that it can have such properties and such dimensions as it actually has, that it may receive such accidents as in reality are noticed in it, and that it may exist in such a place and at such a time as in fact is the case. But it may be larger or smaller, may receive other properties and accidents, and come to existence at an earlier or a later period, or in a different place. Consequently, the fact that a thing has been determined in its composition, size, place, accident, and time, a variation in all these points being possible, is a proof that a being exists which freely chooses and determines these diverse relations. And the circumstance that the universe or a part of it requires a being able to make this selection proves that the universe has been created ex nihilo. For there is no difference which of the following expressions is used: to determine, to make, to create, to produce, to originate, or to intend. These verbs have all one and the same meaning. The Mutakallimim give a great many examples, both of a general and a special character. They say it is not more natural for earth to be under water than to be above water. Who then determined its actual position? Or is it more natural that the sun is round than that it should be square or triangular? For all qualities have the same relation to a body capable of possessing them. Who then determined one particular quality? In a similar way they treat of every individual being. When, for example, they notice flowers of different colors, they are unable to explain the phenomenon, and they take it as a strong proof in favor of their theory. They say, quote, "Behold, the earth is everywhere alike, the water is alike. Why then is this flower red and that one yellow? Some being must have determined the color of each, and that being is God." End quote. A being must therefore exist which determines everything, both as regards the universe generally and each of its parts individually. All this is the logical consequence of the 10th proposition. The theory of determination is, moreover, adopted by some of those who assume the eternity of the universe, as will be explained below. In conclusion, I consider this to be the best argument, and in another part I shall more fully acquaint you with the opinion I have formed concerning the theory of determination. The 6th argument. One of the modern Mutakallimim thought that he had found a very good argument, much better than any advanced hitherto, namely the argument based on the triumph of existence over non-existence. He says that according to the common belief the existence of the universe is merely possible, for if it were necessary, the universe would be God. But he seems to forget that we are at issue with those who, whilst they believe in the existence of God, admit at the same time the eternity of the universe. The expression, "a thing is possible," denotes that the thing may either be in existence or not in existence, and that there is not more reason why it should exist than why it should not exist. The fact that a thing, the existence of which is possible, actually does exist, although it bears the same relation to the state of existence as to that of non-existence, proves that there is a being which gave the preference to existence over non-existence. This argument is very forcible. It is a modified form of the foregoing argument, which is based on the theory of determination. He only chose the term preference instead of determination, and instead of applying it to the properties of the existing being, he applies it to, quote, "the existence of the being itself," end quote. He either had the intention to mislead, or he misunderstood the proposition that the existence of the universe is possible. Our opponent, who assumes the eternity of the universe, employs the term possible and says, quote, "the existence of the universe is possible," end quote, in a sense different from that in which the Mutakallimim applies it, as will be explained below. Moreover, it may be doubted whether the conclusion that the universe owes its origin to a being which is able to give preference to existence over non-existence is correct. For we may apply the terms preference and determination to anything capable of receiving either of two properties which are contrary or opposed to each other. And when we find that the thing actually possesses one property and not the other, we are convinced that there exists a determining agent. For example, you say that a piece of copper could just as well be formed into a kettle as into a lamp. When we find that it is a lamp or a kettle, we have no doubt that a deciding and determining agent had advisedly chosen one of the two possible forms. For it is clear that the substance of copper existed, and that before the determination took place it had neither of the two possible forms which have just been mentioned. When, however, it is the question whether a certain existing object is eternal, or whether it has passed from non-existence into existence, this argument is inadmissible, for it cannot be asked who decided in favor of the existence of a thing and rejected its non-existence, except when it has been admitted that it has passed from non-existence into existence. In the present case, this is just the point under discussion. If we were to take the existence and the non-existence of a thing as mere objects of imagination, we should have to apply the 10th proposition, which gives prominence to imagination and fiction, and ignores the things which exist in reality or are conceived by the intellect. Our opponent, however, who believes in the eternity of the universe, will show that we can imagine the non-existence of the universe as well as we can imagine any other impossibility. It is not my intention to refute their doctrine of the creatio ex nihilo. I only wish to show the incorrectness of their belief that this argument differs from the one which precedes, since in fact the two arguments are identical, and are founded on the well-known principle of determination. The 7th argument. One of the modern Mutakallimim says that he is able to prove the creation of the universe from the theory put forth by the philosophers concerning the immortality of the soul. He argues thus: if the world were eternal, the number of the dead would necessarily be infinite, and consequently an infinite number of souls would coexist. But it has long since been shown that the coexistence of an infinite number of things is positively impossible. This is indeed a strange argument. One difficulty is explained by another, which is still greater. Here the saying well known among the Arameans may be applied, quote, "Your guarantee wants himself a guarantee," end quote. He rests his argument on the immortality of the soul, as though he understood this immortality, in what respect the soul is immortal, or what the thing is which is immortal. If, however, he only meant to controvert the opinion of his opponent, who believed in the eternity of the universe, and also in the immortality of the soul, he accomplished his task, provided the opponent admitted the correctness of the idea which that Mutakallim formed of the philosopher's view on the immortality of the soul. Some of the later philosophers explained this difficulty as follows: the immortal souls are not substances which occupy a locality or a space, and their existence in an infinite number is therefore not impossible. You must bear in mind that those abstract beings, which are neither bodies nor forces dwelling in bodies, and which in fact are ideals, are altogether incapable of being represented as a plurality unless some ideals be the cause of the existence of others, and can be distinguished from each other by the specific difference that some are the efficient cause and others the effect. But that which remains of Said after his death is neither the cause nor the effect of that which is left of Emir, and therefore the souls of all the departed form only one being, as has been explained by Ibn Baker, Ibn al-Saig, and others who ventured to speak on these profound subjects. In short, such intricate disciplines, which our mind can scarcely comprehend, cannot furnish any principles for the explanation of other subjects. It should be noted that whoever endeavors to prove or to disprove the eternity of the universe by these arguments of the Mutakallimim must necessarily rely on one of the two following propositions, or on both of them, namely on the 10th proposition, according to which the actual form of a thing is merely one of many equally possible forms, and which implies that there must be a being capable of making the special selection, or on the 11th proposition, which rejects the existence of an infinite series of things coming successively into existence. The last named proposition is demonstrated in various ways. For example, they advert to a class of transient individuals and to a certain particular date. From the theory which asserts the eternity of the universe, it would follow that the individuals of that class up to that particular date are infinite in number. 1,000 years later, the individuals of that class are likewise infinite in number. The last number must exceed the previous one by the number of the individuals born in those 1,000 years, and consequently one infinite number would be larger than another. The same argument is applied to the revolutions of the heavenly sphere, and in like manner it is shown that one infinite number of revolutions would be larger than another. The same result is obtained when revolutions of one sphere are compared with those of another moving more slowly. The revolutions of both spheres, though unequal, would be infinite in number. Similarly, they proceed with all those accidents which are subject to destruction and production. The individual accidents that have passed into non-existence are counted and represented as though they were still in existence, and as though they were things with a definite beginning. This imaginary number is then either increased or reduced. Yet all these things have no reality and are mere fictions. Abu Nasr al-Farabi, in criticizing this proposition, has exposed all its weak points, as you will clearly perceive when you study his book on the changeable beings earnestly and dispassionately. These are the principal arguments of the Mutakallimim in seeking to establish the creatio ex nihilo. Having thus proved that the universe is not eternal, they necessarily infer that there is an agens who created it in accordance with his intention, desire, and will. They then proceed to prove the unity of that agens, as I am going to point out in the next chapter. End of section 74. Read by Sandra, near Montreal, 2021. Section 75 of the Guide for the Perplexed. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Guide for the Perplexed by Moses Maimonides. Translated by Michael Friedländer. Part 1, Chapter 75, The Kalam. In this chapter I shall explain to you how the Mutakallimim prove the unity of God. They contend that the Maker and Creator of the universe, the existence of whom is testified by all nature, is one. Two propositions are employed by them in demonstrating the unity of God. Vide licit, two deities or more would neutralize each other, and if several deities existed, they would be distinguished from each other by a specific difference. First argument. The first argument is that of mutual neutralization, and is employed by the majority of the Mutakallimim. It is to the following effect. If the universe had two gods, it would necessarily occur that the atom, subject to a combination with one or two opposite qualities, either remained without either of them, and that is impossible, or though being only one atom, included both qualities at the same time, and that is likewise impossible. For example, whilst one of the two deities determined that one atom or more should be warm, The other deity might determine that the same should be cold. The consequence of the mutual neutralization of the two divine beings would thus be that the atoms would neither be warm nor cold, a contingency which is impossible because all bodies must combine with one of two opposites, or they would be at the same time both warm and cold. Similarly, it might occur that whilst one of the deities desired that a body be in motion, the other might desire that it be at rest. The body would then be either without motion and rest, or would both move and rest at the same time. Proofs of this kind are founded on the atomic theory contained in the first proposition of the Mutakallimim, on the proposition which refers to the creation of the accidents, and on the proposition that negatives are properties of actual existence and require for their production an agents. For if it were assumed that the substance of this world, which according to the philosophers is subject to successive production and destruction, is different from the substance of the world above, vide licet from the substance of the spheres, a fact established by proof, and that, as the dualists assert, there are two divine beings, one of whom rules this world without influencing the spheres, whilst the other governs the world above without interfering with this world, such theory would not involve the mutual neutralization of the two deities. If it were then objected that the existence of two deities would necessitate an imperfection in both of them, insofar as one deity would be unable to influence the province of the other, the objection would be met by the reply that this inability need not be considered a defect in either of them, for that which is not included within the sphere of action of being can of course not be performed by that being, and an agence is not deficient in power if it is unable to perform that which is intrinsically impossible. Thus we, monotheists, do not consider it a defect in God that he does not combine two opposites in one object, nor do we test his omnipotence by the accomplishment of any similar impossibility. When the Mutakallimim noticed the weakness of their argument, for which they had some apparent support, they had recourse to another argument. The second argument. If there were two gods, there would necessarily be some element common to both, whilst some element present in the one would be absent in the other, and constitute the specific difference between them. This is a philosophic and sound argument for those who are able to examine it, and to obtain a clear insight into its premises, which will be further explained in our exposition of the view of the philosophers on this point. But it cannot be accepted by those who admit the existence of divine attributes, for according to their opinion, the primal cause includes many different elements. They represent its wisdom and its omnipotence as two different things, and again the omnipotence as different from the will. Consequently, it would not be impossible that either of the two divine beings possessed several properties, some of which would be common to both, and some peculiar to only one of them. Third argument. This argument is likewise based on one of the propositions of the Kalam. For some of the Mutakallimim belonging to the old school assume that when the Creator wills a thing, the will is not an element superadded to the essence of God. It is a will without a substratum. In accordance with the propositions which we have mentioned, and of which, as you will see, it is difficult to form a true conception, they say that one will, which is independent of any substratum, cannot be ascribed to two beings. For, as they assert, one cause cannot be the source of two laws for two essences. This is, as I told you, the method of explaining one difficulty by means of another, and still greater, difficulty. For as they define the will, it is inconceivable, and some have, therefore, considered it to be a mere nonentity. Others who admit its existence meet with many insuperable difficulties. The Mutakallimim, nevertheless, establish on its existence one of the proofs for the unity of God. Fourth argument. The existence of an action is necessarily positive evidence of the existence of an agents, but does not prove the existence of more than one agents. There is no difference whether the existence of one God be assumed, or the existence of 2 or 3 or 20, or any number. This is plain and clear, but the argument does not seem to prove the non-existence of a multitude of deities. It only shows that their number is unknown. The deity may be one sole being, but may also include several divine beings. The following supplemental argument has therefore been advanced. Possibility is inapplicable to the existence of God, which is absolute. The possibility of the existence of more than one God must therefore be denied. This is the whole essence of the proof, and its fallacy is self-evident, for although the notion of possibility cannot be applied to the existence of God, it can be applied to our knowledge of God, for an alternative in our knowledge of a thing does not involve an alternative in the actual existence of the thing, and perhaps there is neither a tripartite deity as the Christians believe, nor an undivided unity as we believe. This is clear to those who have been taught to notice the conclusions implied in given premises. Fifth argument. One of the modern Mutakallimim thought that he found a proof of the unity of God in the idea of requisiteness. Suppose there were two divine beings, if one of them were able to create the universe, the second God would be superfluous, and there would be no need for his existence. If, on the other hand, the entire universe could not be created or governed except by both of them, each of them would be imperfect insofar as he would require the cooperation of another being, and would thus be limited in power. This argument is, in fact, only a variation of, quote, the mutual neutralization of two deities, end quote. There is this difficulty in such proofs, that a certain degree of imperfection is ascribed to a being which does not accomplish tasks beyond its sphere. We do not call a person weak because he cannot move 1,000 hundredweights, and we do not say that God is imperfect because he cannot transform himself into a body, or cannot create another being like himself, or make a square whose diagonal should be equal to one of its sides. In the same manner, we should not consider it an imperfection in God if he were not the only creator, and if it were absolutely necessary that there should be two creators, not because the one God required the assistance of the other, but because the existence of both of them was equally necessary, and because it was impossible that it should be otherwise. Further, we do not say that the Almighty is imperfect because he does not, according to the opinion of the Mutakallimim, produce a body otherwise than by the creation of atoms, and by their combination with accidents created in them. That inability is not called want or imperfection, since another process is impossible. In like manner, the dualist might say that it is impossible for one being to act alone, and that this circumstance constitutes no imperfection in either of the deities, because the absolute existence of one deity necessitates the coexistence of the other. Some of the Mutakallimim, weary of these arguments, declared that the unity of God is a doctrine which must be received as a matter of faith, but most of them rejected this theory and reviled its authors. I, however, hold that those who accept this theory are right-minded and shrink from admitting an erroneous opinion. When they do not perceive any cogency in the arguments and find that the proofs advanced in favor of the doctrine are inconclusive, they prefer to assume that it could only be received as a matter of faith. For the Mutakallimim do not hold that the universe has any divine properties on which a true proof could be founded, or that man's intellect is endowed with any such faculty as would enable him to form correct conclusions. It is, however, not without a motive that they defend this theory. They wish to assume such a form of the universe as could be employed to support a doctrine for which otherwise no proof could be found, and would lead us to neglect the investigation of that which in fact can be proved. We can only appeal to the Almighty and to those intelligent persons who confess their error when they discover it. End of chapter 75. Read by Sandra, 2021. Section 76, Part 1, Chapter 76 of the Guide for the Perplexed. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Guide for the Perplexed by Moses Maimonides, translated by Michael Friedländer. Chapter 76. The Kalam. The reasonings and arguments of the Mutakallimim to demonstrate the incorporeality of God are very weak, and indeed inferior to their arguments for the unity of God. They treat the doctrine of the incorporeality of God as if it were the logical sequence of the theory of his unity, and they say that the attribute one cannot be applied to a corporeal object. Those who maintain that God is incorporeal because a corporeal object consists of substance and form, a combination known to be impossible in the divine being, are not, in my opinion, Mutakallimim, and such an argument is not founded on the propositions of the Kalam. On the contrary, it is a logical proof based on the theory of substance and form, and on a right conception of their properties. It has the character of a philosophical argument, and I shall fully explain it when treating of the arguments of the philosophers. Here we only propose to discuss the arguments by which the Mutakallimim desire to prove the incorporeality of God in accordance with their propositions and the method of their reasoning. First argument. If God were corporeal, his true essence would necessarily either exist entirely in every part of the body, that is to say, in each of its atoms, or would be confined to one of the atoms. In the latter alternative, the other atoms would be superfluous, and the existence of the corporeal being, with the exception of the one atom, would be of no purpose. If, on the other hand, each atom fully represented the divine being, the whole body would not be one deity, but a complex of deities, and this would be contrary to the doctrine adopted by the Kalam that God is one. An examination of this argument shows that it is based on the first and fifth propositions. But there is room for the following objection. Quote, God does not consist of atoms, that is to say, he is not, as you assert, composed of a number of elements created by himself, but is one continuous body, and indivisible except in man's imagination, which affords no test. For in man's imagination the substance of the heavens may be torn or rent asunder. The philosopher holds that such a possibility results from assuming a similarity and an analogy between the visible, i.e., the bodies which exist among us, and the invisible. End quote. Second argument. This argument, they believe, is of great importance. Its main support is the impossibility of comparison, i.e., the belief that God cannot be compared to any of his creatures, and that he would be comparable to other corporeal objects if he were corporeal. They put great stress on this argument and say as follows, quote, if it were asserted that God is corporeal, but that his substance is not like that of other corporeal beings, it would be self-contradictory, for all bodies are alike as regards their substance and are distinguished from each other by other things, vide licet the accidents. End quote. They also argue that if God were corporeal, it would follow that he has created another being like himself. This argument is refuted in two ways. First, the objector does not admit the impossibility of comparison. He asks how it could be proved that God cannot be compared to any of his creatures. No doubt that in support of their view that a comparison between the Almighty and any other being is inadmissible, they would have to cite the words of the prophets, and thus accept this doctrine by the authority of tradition, not by the authority of reason. The argument that God, if comparable to any of his creatures, would be found to have created beings like himself, is refuted by the objector in the following way, quote, the created things are not like him in every respect, for I do not deny that God has many properties and peculiarities. End quote. For he who admits the corporeality of God does not deny the existence of properties in the divine being. Another and more forcible argument is this. All who have studied philosophy and have made themselves thoroughly acquainted with philosophical theories assume as demonstrated facts, first, that the term substance, when applied to the spheres above and to the corporeal objects here on earth, is a perfect homonym, for the substance of the one is not the substance of the other, and secondly, that the forms of the things on this earth are different from the forms of the spheres. The terms substance and form, when applied both to things below and to the spheres above, are homonyms. Although there is no doubt that the spheres have, like the things below, 3 dimensions, they are corporeal because they consist of substance and form, not because they have dimensions. If this explanation is admitted with reference to the spheres, how much more is he who believes that God is corporeal justified in saying that God is a corporeal being which has dimensions, but which in its substance, its true nature and properties, is very different from all created bodies, and that the term substance is applied to him and to his creatures homonymously, in the same manner as the true believers, who have a correct conception of the divine idea, apply the term existence homonymously to him and to his creatures. The corporealists do not admit that all bodies consist of similar atoms. They believe that God created all things, and that these differ from each other both in their substances and in their constituent properties, and just as the substance of dung differs from the substance of the sun, so does, according to this theory, the substance of the spheres and the stars differ from the substance of the created light, that is, the divine glory, Shekhinah. And again, the substance of the divine glory, or the pillar of cloud created for the purpose, differ from the substance of the Most High. For the substance of the latter is sublime, perfect, simple, constant, and immutable. His absolute existence remains always the same, and he creates all things according to his will and desire. How could this argument, though it be weak, be refuted by these strange methods of the Mutachalimim, which I pointed out to you? Third argument. If God were corporeal, he would be finite, and so far this argument is correct. If he were finite, he would have certain dimensions and a certain form. This is also a correct conclusion. But they continue thus. Attribute to God any magnitude or form whatever. He might be either large or smaller, and might also have a different form. The fact that he has one special magnitude and one special form presupposes the existence of a determining agens. I have heard that they attach great importance to this argument, but in truth it is the weakest of all the arguments mentioned above. It is founded on the 10th proposition, the feebleness of which, in ignoring the actual properties of things, we have clearly shown in regard to ordinary beings, and must be much more evident in regard to the Creator. There is no difference between this argument and their assertion that the fact of the existence of the universe having been preferred to its non-existence proves the existence of an agens that preferred the existence of the universe to its non-existence at a time when both were equally possible. If it were asked why this argument should not be applied to God, vide licet, that his mere existence proved the existence of an agens, which determined his existence and rejected his non-existence, they would undoubtedly answer that this admission would only lead to a repetition of the same argument until at length a being be found whose existence is not merely potential but necessary, and which does not require a causa efficiens. But this same answer can also be applied to dimensions and to form. It can only be said, in reference to all other forms and magnitudes, the existence of which is possible, that is to say, which came into existence after a state of non-existence, that they might have been larger or smaller than they actually are, or that they might have had a form different from that which they actually possess, and require for this reason some determining agens. But the forms and dimensions of God, who is above all imperfection and similitude, did not come into existence according to the opinion of the corporealist after a state of non-existence, and therefore no determining agens was necessary. His substance with its dimensions and forms has a necessary existence. No agens was required to decide upon his existence and to reject his non-existence, since non-existence is altogether inadmissible in God. In like manner, there was no force required to determine his magnitude and form. They were absolutely inseparable from his existence. If you wish to go in search of truth, to cast aside your passions, your tradition, and your fondness of things you have been accustomed to cherish, if you wish to guard yourself against error, then consider the fate of these speculators and the result of their labors. Observe how they rushed, as it were, from the ashes into the fire. They denied the nature of the existing things, misrepresented the properties of heaven and earth, and thought that they were able by their propositions to prove the creation of the world, but in fact they were far from proving the creatio ex nihilo, and have weakened the arguments for the existence, the unity, and the incorporeality of God. The proofs of all these doctrines must be based on the well-known nature of the existing things, as perceived by the senses and the intellect. Having thus discussed the arguments of the Mutachalimim, we shall now proceed to consider the propositions of the philosophers, and their arguments for the existence of God, his unity, and his incorporeality, and we shall for the present assume the eternity of the universe without finally accepting it. Next to this we shall develop our own method, which is the result of deep study in demonstrating these three principles, and we shall then examine the theory of the eternity of the universe as assumed by the philosophers. End of section 76. End of the book, Guide for the Perplexed, Part 1, by Moses Maimonides, translated by Michael Friedländer. Read by Czandra, 2021.